Hello! Long time no siege, as they say in the medieval period. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm starting a minute early so we can get the whole can everybody hear me, is everything working out of the way. I just realised my microphone was miles away, so hopefully volume is a little bit better now. And now we wait the 30 seconds to see what everybody is saying. Okay, excellent. People are saying we can hear it. Okay, cool. Right, so welcome to the return of the Drydock live streams. It's been a while. Going off to Scandinavia and so forth kind of pushed, well, let's say, all the time I had has been occupied by either being in Scandinavia, getting back and catching up from Scandinavia, and making the regular videos, and of course looking after Mini Drag. So now we have time, so now we're catching up, and well, we'll just have to do these kind of paired catch-ups until we get vaguely close to normal. So with that said, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, what we're doing here is alternate history questions from the Patreon Drydock. So the alternate history stuff gets answered here. And then once we've got through that, there are 25 questions today. Then we'll pick up the super chats. So I've picked up Captain Charlemagne's one, and then we'll head on into regular chats, essentially until either I run out of energy or it gets ridiculously warm in here, because unfortunately this is the UK, so it's currently climbing temperature. And I've got an aircon unit, but I can't use it while I'm on stream because it will be incredibly loud. Right, so Michael Hamilton asks, have you ever considered doing a series on admirals of the American Civil War, such as Farragut, Porter, and Dahlgren, similar to your series on other famous admirals like Nelson, King, and Nimitz? Yes, I have, but it's kind of, there's a very long list of admirals I want to cover. Some of them I've got scripts almost ready to go for, others I'm still researching. So they are on the list, but, you know, some way down said list. And sometimes the Patreon votes bump people up. So, for example, with Spruance, part of the reason you're getting a multi-part on Spruance is, well, he did a fair bit, so there's a lot to say. But also, when they voted for me to actually talk about Spruance, I'd got 95% of a script on Spruance already completed, but I hadn't done my usual pass of compression, which would usually get it down to maybe 50 minutes to an hour 10. And so I decided, you know what, stuff that if you're going to vote on Spruance, I'm going to just split it into 3 or 4 parts, complete the few bits I haven't done up till now, and off it goes. Which, funnily enough, actually has spawned its own little video, because obviously I've got to do the last video for Johnny Walker. I've got to do 1, possibly 2 more videos, depending on how it splits down for Spruance. And the last one I do on Spruance has actually spawned its own video, which is going to come out on Friday, talking a little bit more about the intricacies of who exactly was in command at Midway, because some people did raise some questions in the comments there. So, Architect 096. In fantasy books without black powder, we see ships using various tension and torsion-powered weapons as an equivalent to cannon, despite them not being as powerful. I'm interested in how you would see the evolution of warships in a world where cannons weren't available. Would ships remain just platforms for infantry combat, or would we get artillery exchanges using catapults? Well, you do get, obviously, various forms of heavy projectile weapon, whether they be ballistas, onagers, mangonels, etc., back in, if you like, the ancient era, the Greco-Roman era. That kind of dies away over the hundreds, and by the time you get to the medieval period, especially the late medieval period, just before cannon come along, there are a few, if you like, artillery ships. There's a few siege-adapted vessels that have trebuchets on them and so forth. But the vast majority of artillery in the medieval period is siege artillery, whereas a lot more of the Greco-Roman period artillery was battlefield artillery. And of course, battlefield artillery is much easier to adapt to a sea battle than, trebuchets firing in massive ballistic arcs, because, to be perfectly honest, the chances of a trebuchet mounted on a ship hitting another ship are extremely slim. I mean, it's difficult enough to hit a castle on land, let alone a much smaller moving target. But there are smaller catapults and so forth, so could those artillery exchanges recur as ships get larger if cannons aren't around? Potentially, but because of the limitations in range and power, especially against something like a Carvel-built Carrack or something, I suspect it's going to be more about the payload than the projectile velocity, because realistically you aren't going to be loading up a tension-powered or counterweight-powered catapult of any description with the kind of penetration power of a cannonball anytime soon. Again, certainly not with any degree of accuracy. But if you restricted yourself to smaller artillery weapons that could project something onto an enemy ship that was then perhaps, say, on fire, that would be far more useful. So, yeah, I think there would be a limited amount of artillery exchanges, but given the reload speed and the short range, warships, I think, would still be primarily about infantry and battles and crossbows and longbows and that kind of stuff. Nostromo 89, would an introduction to Mini Drac be possible sometime in the near future? Well, if you want to see what Mini Drac was like near the very start of life, you can check the previous live stream. Mini Drac starred there at the beginning. Mini Drac is currently downstairs. I'm not adverse to Mini Drac appearing on the stream, but right now, Mini Drac is being fed. Texas and La Choc asks, I was recently able to visit the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, where, among other things, they talk about how the Mob had considerable power bases along the waterfronts, though it was usually among the docker unions. This got me looking into the Mafia Navy connections, which led to Navy Intelligence Unit B3 and a deal with boss Salvatore Luciano to root out fascist agents. Are there any other naval connections with the Mob? Unfortunately, mob history in the US is not my strong point, by, let's say, a fair way. There, however, inevitably is going to be a certain degree of connection, because, when the mob has a significant presence on dockside, albeit mostly on civilian docksides, bear in mind, obviously, the Navy does use private yards as well as Navy yards, so there is inevitably going to be some cross-pollination, and as we know, all through history, a degree of corruption as well. But by its very nature, most of that stuff is going to be fairly concealed, and it would require specialist research, I think, to dig it up beyond some very surface-level stuff. So unless somebody has done a particular set of research on the Mob and the Navy, aside from, yes, there almost certainly were connections, I'm afraid I don't really know much more than that. The Judge 2017 asks, in a clerical error, the King George V class of World War I is replaced by the King George V class of World War II. How does the Royal Navy respond to this slight change, and how does the Battle of Jutland go if the Royal Navy deploys King George V of 1939 instead of the Home Fleet version? Could the Home Fleet win... Oh, sorry, instead of the Home Fleet, I suppose you mean the Grand Fleet. Could the Grand Fleet still win Jutland just with these ships? Okay, so in theory, if we're taking all of them, including Prince of Wales, that would be 5 King George V's. well, I mean, you've got two different scenarios there, haven't you? You've got King George V of World War One being replaced by World War Two. That's obviously a huge force multiplier for the Royal Navy. Yes, they are far more modern. Hopefully the crews will know how to maintain the radar for at least a little while. Yes, they do run on oil fuel, but there is oil fuel. Obviously, the Queen Elizabeths use it. Well, all Royal Navy dreadnoughts use it in spray form. The Queen Elizabeths run on it exclusively. So keeping them going probably isn't going to be too difficult in the short term, but in the long term, some elements will probably start breaking down. So they'll probably be sparingly used. If the Battle of Jutland deploys, the Royal Navy deploys them instead of the historical King George V, well, of course, as with almost any scenario involving Jutland and World War II ships, radar is the single biggest game changer, because the uptime King George V's can detect the High Seas Fleet as they're coming in through the murk, and they can see where they're going afterwards. And that's in and of itself a game changer for Jellicoe, as the same as it, to a certain degree, it would be if the roles were reversed and it was German ships with radar. Of course, then you've also got the fact that the King George V's all have the latest version of the Admiralty fire control table, which combines with their radar, so they're going to be doing a huge amount more damage to the Germans, because the shells also work. But could the 5 King George V's win Jutland on their own? In a straight-up fight, there are too many Germans. However, if the Grand Fleet is replaced by the King George V, so the battle cruiser fleet is still there, you might be able to scare Scheer into running away still, because remember, that would leave Beatty with the battle cruisers, except for the battle cruiser squadron, and the Queen Elizabeth, so the run to the south is pretty much going to go the way that it does historically, as does the run to the north. But remember, the German fleet comes in and gets its T crossed. Now, if you're talking about 50 14-inch guns guided by radar with World War II British fire control on them, potentially being able to open up beyond the Germans' physical ability to see through the murk, then you're going to have first scouting group and then the leading German ships run into gunfire that's going to be disturbingly close, going to do quite a bit of damage, and coming from a set of ships that they cannot see at all. All they're going to see is muted flashes of muzzles somewhere off in the murk. Now, as far as Scheer is concerned, he's run into the British fleet, but they have some kind of secret weapon that allows them to fire from a place that he can't see them, and damage would be adding up quite quickly. At which point, Scheer is probably going to make his battle turn away. So, some battle cruisers and battleships are probably going to be quite badly hit, and then the King George V's could, because obviously they have a speed advantage, they could chase the Germans down and pick them off as the day goes on and as nighttime falls. But they would be playing very much a brinkmanship game of essentially scaring Scheer with the fact that they can shoot him where he can't see them, so he doesn't know how many ships are out there or what they're doing, only that they're doing something he can't respond to. And, yes, another admiral might decide, stuff it, we're going to charge headlong and see what's actually out there, but as we know, Scheer's not that kind of admiral. As compared to some other scenarios where you have modern ships in Jutland, in this case, because you have 5 of them, it almost tips the balance into actually that might be enough to pull it off on their own. Oh, what have I done? I've done something stupid, right? Good. Gazenberg is collecting the super chats. That is very helpful. Thank you very much. So I'm not going to miss any of them. Right, back to questions then. Duke Master, Clark Griswold is a well-known and inventive is well known to be a wise and inventive man. Would his in-development lubricant and near-frictionless lubrication it provides be of any naval benefit? Who is Clark Griswold? That is a question. Oh, he is a fictional character from National Lampoon's Vacation. Okay. Near frictionless lubrication, yes, that would be a huge naval benefit, because that means that you get much more efficient propulsion systems, because the energy loss is due to friction as you go from turbine, from boiler to turbine to screw, or via the gears, or with turboelectric drive, etc. You lose a lot less energy, so your power plant becomes considerably more efficient. So you either go faster, or you can have a smaller power plant. And, well, anything that moves, the guns, the turrets, etc., etc., if that can all move fairly frictionlessly, then, yeah, that would be a huge benefit. John Dietz asks, could you see his questions from February and March? I'm pretty sure I have seen them. Yes. But in any case, he says, if you can't, the February question was an alt history question that boiled down to, what would the world's navies look like if everyone had independently come to the conclusion the 5-inch 38 was the best secondary armament and everyone had adopted it? And the other one was if you'd received any submissions for the Royal Navy fleet based wholly off the design of Great Eastern. I am working on a alternate history, probably for an April Fool's, of Great Eastern based warships. So that is still happening, albeit in abeyance at the moment, because obviously it's a little bit of a while till April. What will the world's navies have looked like if everyone had independently decided to adopt the 5-inch 38, assuming, I guess, that the US had sold it to everyone, or at least sold the design patterns? Well, I suppose there's two strands to that. The more complicated one is, of course, if you look at the US destroyers and so forth, they use the 5-inch 38 as their main guns. That would change a huge amount as well. But if we restrict ourselves, for the sake of sanity, to just looking at secondary armaments, and everyone adopts it, well, what's it going to affect? Well, everyone gets a boost, obviously. I mean, the Italian 90 mils that are being replaced with 5-inch 38s, they can reach further, they're more reliable, the mountings certainly, albeit a lot of it is also going to come down to fire control systems, because ultimately when you look at the 5-inch 38 in 1942, it doesn't really do all that much, whereas the proximity fuse and radar fire control really bring it into its own. Same with the Japanese. Yes, the 5-inch 38 can fire more quickly and traverse faster than the 5-inch gun the Japanese are using, so they do get a small increase in their anti-aircraft capabilities, but without the aforementioned proximity fuses. Excuse me, I've got something in my eye. Without the aforementioned proximity fuses and radar fire control, that effect is limited. Some more American planes get shot down, but doesn't change all that much. Now, where things get more interesting is the German and Royal Navies. The Royal Navy, of course, does get radar-directed fire control and proximity fuses. So replacing the 5.25 early on with the 5-inch 38, I mean, that's a general all-up increase in performance, at least as long as it's only in the secondary batteries. Dido's armed with 5-inch 38s, I think, wouldn't have performed quite as well as they did historically in the Mediterranean. But, yeah, King George V with 5.25s, is it going to save Prince of Wales? Probably not, but you never know. If a few of those extra rounds it's able to kick out manage to down the bomber that drops the torpedo that eventually in real life hits its stern. The thing is, the Royal Navy doesn't actually use the 5.25 all that much for secondaries. It's just the King George V and Vanguard. Everything else is using 4.7s, 4.5s, and 4s. Although I suppose everyone's adopting it wholesale as a secondary battery, so I mean, yeah, that's going to be a marked improvement. I'll be interested to see if it could fit in the flat pancake mounts that the British used in their carriers. Otherwise, the 5-inch 38 historical mount is going to get in the way of aircraft operations, which might be a bit annoying. And of course, it's going to be slightly heavier potentially than the 4s and 4.7s on some other ships. But hey, the Royal Navy now has a uniform caliber for the secondaries, which is going to be quite helpful. And of course, as I said, they actually do have the fire control to exploit it eventually to its best capability. And the Germans are not too shabby with their anti-aircraft fire control, certainly by the mid to late point of the war, albeit they don't have too many ships. So mostly because of those limitations in fire control and the lack of proximity fuses, if everybody uses the 5-inch 38, the net benefit is actually still on the Allied side, although the Axis navies would become better in their heavy anti-aircraft. They're not going to become as good as the British and the Americans would. Doris asks, it's the morning of February 6th, 1922, and last night an impassioned speech from Admiral Horatio Clarkson convinced the signatories of the Washington Naval Treaty to add an addendum that as water is life, so is power, and this clause will exempt the full powertrain from displacement calculations. Assuming this holds through London, how does the seascape change through the interwar and early World War II periods? Everybody goes a lot faster, because if the powertrain is exempt from displacement, well, let me grab this copy of Friedman's British Battleships, and let's find, here we go, King George V's. So the machinery on the King George V's, no, that's the early designs. That's also early designs. Still on designs. Come on, show me where the actual ship is. 14L. Here we go. King George V, as built, has 2,770 tons of machinery. So near enough 3,000 tons. So if 3,000 tons of machinery, near enough makes no difference, is now not part of the design requirements, that means you've got 3,000 extra tons to play with, which, for example, on a King George V, that more than buys back the B turret becoming a quad 14, and potentially also, you know, expand, maybe make the machinery a little bit more powerful, because it doesn't really matter about the displacement of it too much. Obviously, you have to still make the ship float, but for treaty purposes, it doesn't matter. So you could potentially use a slightly more heavily armoured King George V with all 12 guns, and it would technically still be at 35,000 tons. Likewise, for the South Dakotas, for example, they wouldn't be forced to be as compact as they are. They'd probably look more like the North Carolinas, but with more armour, because they can, you know, use what would have been otherwise the weight of their machinery spaces and equipment to make the ship larger and somewhat better protected, and so on and so forth. So essentially, the ships that had to sacrifice stuff to fit into the treaty limits are going to not have to sacrifice those things, and ships that otherwise were fairly comfortable designs are going to get probably considerably quicker. I mean, destroyers, considering how much proportionally the weight of machinery is in destroyers, you might get some very heavily armed, you know, 3 or 4 twin mount destroyers with twin sets of torpedo launchers probably become the standard, and, you know, 35 to 38 knots as well. Yeah, that's an interesting one. HNOMS Schleswig Holstein, I think, maybe, asks, if Zinovy, Rozesvensky, and John Paul Jones had swapped places with Rozesvensky being placed in command of Jones's squadron leading up to and during the Battle of Flamborough Head, and Jones being placed in command of the 2nd Pacific Squadron for the trip to and during the Battle of Tsushima, how might the unreadiness and performance of their ships have differed? Would Rozesvensky's mental health while in command of Jones's dysfunctional squadron suffer more than the mental health of the undertrained men of the 2nd Pacific Squadron while under Jones's abusive command? And would one be more successful than they were historically? How much screaming would there be? There would be a lot of screaming. I have a feeling Rozesvensky's now in command of the squadron heading up to Flamborough Head would be considerably more successful, because whilst Rozesvensky was driven to distraction by the state of his fleet, he was overall a fairly competent officer who did the best he could with a very, very bad hand. And most of his officers actually liked him. So, being in a position where everybody doesn't actively hate you and want to shoot you when battle commences means that the US squadron that fights the Battle of Flamborough Head is going to be far, far more organized, and probably will succeed in taking Serapis without the loss of Bonhomme Richard, albeit given the state Bonhomme Richard was in, that was probably the most merciful thing that could ever have happened to it. So, clouds with silver linings and all that. 2nd Pacific Squadron, with the best will in the world, whilst Jones was a very, very courageous commander, as that whole Flamborough Head campaign showed, he was not a very good people person. And just actively screaming at people is not going to help. Especially because, of course, Rozesvensky, being from the 20th century, knowing his history, will be much more quickly able to adapt to command of a sailing squadron than Jones will be able to adapt to all this newfangled steel and so forth. So I have a feeling that, given between that and Jones's complete antipathy to the British, we might end up with Beresford actually taking on the 2nd Pacific Squadron somewhere either in the Channel or off the sort of Atlantic Mediterranean joining area. Mike Lima 777 asks, suppose the following warships were saved as museum ships, survived World War III, and were then preserved into the 24th century in Star Trek. In what order would the Klingons rank them for impressiveness and glory in battle? Warspite, Enterprise, Victory, Haida, Bliskovica, Washington, Massachusetts, MacArthur, Admiral Yee's flagship, whatever that was called. That's a long list. Given that the Klingons value honor in personal combat as well as in battle generally, then Victory is probably going to be seen as the most honorable, because obviously it's fighting muzzle to muzzle with ships like Redoutable. It lasts for ages. Nelson, of course, goes to Stovert Corps because he dies in glorious battle. Admiral Yee's flagship is probably pretty much in that same boat, ironically enough. So those would be the ones the Klingons rank the most impressive. And at that point, then the destroyers, so Haida and Bliskovica, are probably going to be the next ones up, because of course they fight fast, daring, close-range actions, much like how the Klingons love their birds of prey. After that, Warspite for its battle honors and Washington for its execution of Kirishima, and then probably Massachusetts, MacArthur, and Enterprise after that, because for Massachusetts and MacArthur fighting mostly just generally at range, and Enterprise has won many glorious battles and has taken many hits, so has proven her durability, but ultimately is fighting at very long range, which obviously the Klingons prefer to be up close and personal. George H. asks, consider this scenario for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Center Force changes place with Southern Force, okay, and in a potentially catastrophic mix-up of American intel and reconnaissance, Kurita's force of Yamato, Musashi, the two Congos and Nagato, and their cruisers and destroyers steam up Surigao Strait in the middle of the night, encountering the 7th Fleet battle line. 6 modernized standard-type battleships, along with cruisers, destroyers, and PT boats. Can radar-controlled 16-inch and 14-inch guns with advanced fire control on West Virginia, California, and Tennessee, as well as the less advanced fire controls found on Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania, hold off Yamato, Musashi, and their consorts? And would 7th Fleet find itself overly concentrating on the largest targets, and so leave the less well-armoured Nagato, Congo, and Haruna to fire unopposed? That's actually a really vicious alternate history scenario, because Center Force with Yamato and Musashi, and presumably at that point Atago, etc., all intact, that actually has the force, assuming it shows up, as mentioned, in Surigao Strait unmolested up to that point, that actually has the force and durability to force its way into close combat with 7th Fleet. Now, 7th Fleet is going to cause quite a lot of damage going in, but of course the other thing is, how is this formation going through Surigao? Is Kurita going to send Yamato Musashi at the head, or is he going to send some of his smaller capital ships at the head, or is he going to lead in with cruisers and destroyers? Because the battleships of 7th Fleet are going to have to open up on the first big contacts they see. If that's Yamato and Musashi, the Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania can damage them, but of course, sooner or later, if they're proceeding at speed, Yamato and Musashi will survive long enough to get into their own range and return fire, and the other ships are going to arrive, at least as far as battleship gunfire is concerned, fairly unmolested. The cruiser and destroyer gunfire and all the torpedoes in the water might have something different to say about that, but that could get very, very messy. Whereas if, let's say, Congo and Haruna are leading, they would be in just as bad a state as the historical ships that went into Surigao Strait, but then they buy time for Nagato, Yamato, and Musashi to close in and then get into gunfire range as far as their fire control systems are concerned, relatively unmolested. And there's going to be long lances in the water left, right, and centre from the Japanese cruisers and destroyers. Of course, American torpedoes, which work at this point, are going to be coming back the other way. So it's going to be incredibly messy, and I think a lot of it is going to turn on sheer luck, because the fighting is probably going to degenerate into very close range combat, where essentially almost everybody's main guns, capital ship wise, can punch through everybody else's armor. At which point, if, let's say, Maryland, or let's say West Virginia, manages to get the drop on Musashi and deliver 8 16-inch shells point blank into its side, that could be one and done for Musashi, or near enough. Conversely, Yamato might be able to go triple 18, triple 18, triple 18 and execute Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania, or put them in sinking condition in fairly short order if it manages to get within 4,000 or 5,000 yards range. So it would be a complete and utter mess, and you could run that scenario, I think, a dozen times, and every answer would be very, very different. Of course, come daylight, the at that point unengaged Taffys 1, 2, and 3 would be hitting you with 300 plus aircraft, which wouldn't be very pleasant for the Japanese survivors, if there are any. But there is a non-zero chance the Japanese might be able to punch at least some ships through to the landing areas. But equally, they might all be contained in a massive broiling mess of torpedoes and gunfire if some of their leading ships slew out of line and then start blocking the approach of the others. Okay, so that's 10 out of the 25 alternate history questions done. I'm not doing too badly time-wise. Dennis Medeiros Jr. You're in command of the High Seas Fleet, Part 2. You've just finished fighting the Battle of Jutland as described in your Q&A live stream in November, on November 30th. Now, knowing what you know and the butterfly effect is in full force, how would you maximise the opportunities that this historic victory opens up in the short term for the High Seas Fleet and for Germany overall? And what effect does this have on British and Royal Navy politics and military operations? Do they put Jellicoe quietly in the tower? Do they publicly execute him? If 3 Queen Elizabeths are lost, including Queen Elizabeth herself, and the battle cruiser squadron is destroyed, etc. Well, I mean, Jellicoe will not be in command of the Grand Fleet, but, you know, they're not going to do anything massively dramatic. Apart from anything else, for morale purposes, they're just going to need him to quietly shuffle out of the way. In terms of how the High Seas Fleet could exploit a temporary opportunity like that, there are a few ways that you could do that. One of which would be to sail your surviving fast, well-armoured ships, so your cruisers, potentially even your surviving armoured cruisers, battle cruisers, etc. And as long as you know some of the pathways through the North Sea minefields, try and break the blockade while the Royal Navy is licking its wounds to get some trade going, albeit that's a little bit risky. There's obviously convoys to and from Scandinavia that you could attack, but I think if you've not got the threat of the Grand Fleet in the immediate future, probably the single worst thing you could do to the British would be to have a screening force sail to stop any potential last-ditch interference, and then send a fairly fast, powerful strike force into the Channel to completely disrupt British and Royal Navy supply lines to and from France, so troop transport, supply transports, etc. So not only taking out the ships that are in the Channel, but also going up to bombard the ports on both sides of the Channel, because if you can, and take some mine layers with you, lay a bunch of mines, because if the British Expeditionary Force, or at that point the British Army in France, suddenly finds itself unable to receive reinforcements, unable to send casualties back, and unable to receive supplies for any significant amount of time, that could open a window for the German army to then start trying to punch through. Now, admittedly, it's the middle of 1916. The German army has other things as priorities on its mind, but a sudden cessation of pressure on the areas where the British are operating could potentially give the German army a significant chance to actually make something of the war. It just depends on how long that disruption effect lasts. And of course, the thing is, the longer the Royal Navy takes to put things back together, the more you can potentially repeat that operation, and obviously the more damage you do. Cat 2V. If the Great Depression is not as severe, giving Japan, Britain and the US enough funding to resume battleship construction at the end of the 10-year holiday of the Washington Naval Treaty, and disagreements during the London Naval Treaty see the building holiday of battleships expire rather than be renewed, but the 35,000-ton 16-inch main battery limitations remain in place, what kind of designs were the 3 major naval powers looking at building in the early 1930s, assuming they're each able to build at least one class of ships? So the Japanese were looking at the Congo class replacements, which we've covered in a 5-minute guide. So they would have been essentially hyper-compact 35,000-ton 16-inch armed fast battleships. Their utility, I mean, they would be very powerful ships, very heavily armed. Their citadel's incredibly tiny, though, so they would have vulnerabilities. And of course that means no Congos, but these things instead, which ups the threat of the Japanese Navy come World War II. The British, we know what they were going to do pretty much. So we have designed 16A, which is essentially an 8-gun, 6-inch turret, secondary battery battleship. A relatively conventional thing, to be all things considered. What the US would build is a little bit more up in the air, because with the Japanese, we know the Congos were coming up for replacement. We know what they wanted. With the British, 16A or some variant thereon is most likely. The Americans were still struggling immensely with what they wanted to build, as kind of to a certain extent covered in the development of the North Carolina class video. They were going back and forth over numbers of guns, positioning of guns. Do we build a hybrid battle carrier? Do we use turboelectric drive or not? Or do we use geared turbines? So I think the Americans are probably the least predictable, but they probably would have ended up actually, weirdly, I think if they stick with 16-inch guns, they probably would have gone with a Nelson-style layout, or at least an all-forward layout, even if not specifically Nelson-style. Whereas the British, having built the Nelsons, probably would have gone back the other way. Bruce Kiernan asks, if Courageous and Glorious had not been lost so early in the war, what impact might they have had in later parts of it? Would there have been any way to do an upgrade to either, say, putting in a full-length flight deck? Unless one of them gets badly damaged, I don't think anyone's going to be extending their flight decks anytime soon. With that said, if they are badly damaged, and there is a reasonable chance that could happen since they are not armoured flight deck carriers, then it would make sense to extend their flight decks because, you know, yes, you obviously have to do balance calculations and loading, etc., but ultimately sticking an extra bit of flight deck on the front is not the world's most complicated task. So wartime might allow that upgrade, but only if they do take significant damage in other campaigns. The question, of course, is where are they going to be put? I mean, using them as part of the shuttle run force going to reinforce Malta, i.e. in the Western Mediterranean, makes a certain amount of sense. Sending them into the Eastern Mediterranean early on, I think, could work. I mean, you have Eagle operating there for a while. So potentially Taranto might be a considerably larger raid, because instead of having Illustrious and Eagle to hand, if Cunningham has Illustrious, Eagle, Courageous and Glorious to hand and Eagle goes down, well, you've got more Swordfish and 3 flight decks, so you could have a lot of fun with that. But I have a feeling you're going to need to, once the arrival of Fliegerkorps 10 and generally Regia or Aeronautica bombing as well starts to get more and more accurate, you're probably going to want them out of the Mediterranean, or at least the eastern part of the Mediterranean, rather sharpish. The flip side to that, of course, is that you might end up pulling them out of the Med to assign them to Somerville with the Eastern Fleet instead of the armoured flight deck carriers, which can then be kept in the Med, which will boost, obviously, the Mediterranean fleet's carrier capability. And we know that historically, at least, Somerville's operations didn't really amount to a huge amount with Operation C and so forth. But with more carrier flight decks available, you might also, leading on from that, when the US is asking for carriers at the end of 42 because they're running out, I'm not necessarily sure they'd want Courageous or Glorious, but having Courageous or Glorious to hand, perhaps now reallocated to the home fleet, where they just need to be around to potentially chase down German surface raiders, might allow the British, again, the flexibility to shake loose another carrier, so you get 2 instead of 1, which was originally what was proposed. Of course, all of this is assuming they don't get hit by a U-boat or sunk by bombers or something as you go down the line. So, there is that to consider. But so, yeah, they could have had quite a considerable impact just by their existence freeing up other more modern carriers. It's just a question of how long do they last. Eugene Thatcher asks, you always hear about Yamato versus Iowa, and I know you have your normal caveats for 1v1 battle, so given those, I'm curious about King George V versus Yamato. How do you see that fight going? Essentially, with King George V versus Yamato, it's almost a binary thing based on weather. So, you know, I pointed out in the past, in flat, calm, nice sunny day, Yamato has an edge over Iowa, but Iowa can still hurt Yamato. So it's not, although Yamato has an advantage, it's not completely clear cut. With the King George V's guns having less penetration than a 16-inch 50, and British battle doctrine being to get relatively close, which, you know, Yamato's 18-inch guns can be kind of a problem at that range, even though King George V is very heavily armored. In that kind of open daytime environment, Yamato has quite a significant advantage over the King George V's. Also, obviously, King George V doesn't have a speed advantage, particularly over Yamato, which the Iowas do. So, in open, clear daytime combat, Yamato has a very clear advantage one-on-one against King George V, unless King George V gets very, very lucky and scores some kind of fire control system kill with an early salvo. But that then, much as Iowa versus Yamato does, flips on its head if the weather gets really bad. So if there's loads of fog, squalls, rain, something that reduces visibility, or worse still, night, and now the British are able to bring their radar into play, especially mid to late war radar, to guide their gunfire, when Yamato, depending on her time period, either doesn't have radar or doesn't have radar that can be used for fire control, then, you know, it all flips back around, because now Yamato is going to have a hard time hitting King George V, or potentially seeing it at all, and King George V can then utilize that to either shell Yamato from range to cripple it before closing in for a kill, or potentially, depending on the relative technology levels and who's paying attention, potentially even get close enough for her guns to actually start punching through the more armored sections of Yamato, kind of like Washington versus Hiroshima. That's going to be a quite close range, but it now does offer a lot of options. So the nighttime advantage goes to King George V, with the caveat that, of course, compared to Iowa at night, King George V needs to get somewhat closer to inflict critical damage, which puts it at more risk. Cracked Cactus asks, we've covered Germany and Britain for alternate World War II scenarios. What would Drac do if he was in charge of the naval forces of Japan during the interwar years, such as would carrier focus be more emphasized? And secondly, providing the army of Japan was not wiped out during my tenure, what would you do as commander-in-chief? Kick the war off in China or focus on material producing regions? Well, if I was commander-in-chief of Japan and, yeah, was able to knock the heads of the army and the navy together without being assassinated, which would be a legitimate risk in that time period, but assuming that somehow everybody is listening to my authority, well, ideally you want to avoid a war entirely, because you can't win a war, whatever scenario you set up, really, against the industrial might of the Allies, especially the US. However, if I have to go to war, then I would pretty much pull the whole China thing, at least the war in mainland China, because that eats up a huge amount of time, a huge amount of money, and a huge amount of men, and, you know, ammunition and so forth. And of course, the ongoing campaigns in China are what gets me oil embargoed by the US in the first place. So I would take Formosa, now Taiwan. Obviously, you know, Korea, Manchuria, all that kind of stuff would be retained. But then by retaining huge amounts of money, ammunition, and men, I would be in a much better position come my sudden surge out into the rest of the Pacific. And of course, I can choose my timing on that a lot more carefully, because I'm not going to be at risk of running out of oil, in theory. I can, you know, get the Yamatos into service. I mean, I'd be pressing for more carrier construction anyway, and much more widely training pilots and so forth, but I can then choose my time and place of advance, seize the resources that I need, and because I've got a lot more men, a lot more guns, and potentially a lot more ships, I can then secure my border areas and have a much greater fuel reserve to play off. And I mean, again, it's not going to work long term, but I can certainly hold out a lot longer. Although, of course, the interesting thing at that point is it means that probably some slightly more distant base, one of the islands bases or something, is going to get nuked first, which might give an opportunity to surrender without Japan getting itself nuked. But, all bets are off once wartime comes. Patrick Donnelly asks, in May 1943, the combined fleet was ready to sortie to the Aleutian Islands, but it was called off once Attu Island was liberated. Had it still sortied anyway, if for nothing else than for spite, what forces could Nimitz call on to counter them? Well, at that point, Essex herself is just about in service, but not really ready. She's commissioned, but she's still got to work up and make her way to Pearl Harbor. So, yeah, you're essentially looking at the nadir of US carrier forces. But then with that said, of course, you've already had Midway, so the Japanese aren't exactly in much better shape. You've got some fast battleships in service. You've got Washington, North Carolina, although North Carolina may still be under repairs at that point. Some of the South Dakotas coming online. So you've got essentially the embryonic form of US 1940s production, the Independences, Essexes, etc. But if the full combined fleet sails, ironically enough, in May 1943, although the US is in a much better position, the US Navy, you'd probably still be looking at something like a Midway-style operation where the US allows the Japanese to approach their targets and then tries to hit them on their way, rather than a straight-up stop-them-cold battle, because, yeah, US resources haven't quite recovered to the point where they could where they would want to take that risk. They could take that risk, but Nimitz isn't an idiot, so Midway worked. Cap 198462 says, interesting, Emperor Drac of Japan would still start the Pacific War. Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to, but the problem is, if I'm in charge of Japan in the 1930s, sooner or later I'm going to start a Pacific War, or I'm going to be assassinated, at which point whoever might succeed me is going to start a Pacific War. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, assuming the Italians kept Dante Alighieri past 1930, how would they have gone about modernizing her, given her different design and layout compared to the Andrea Doria and Conte di Cavour classes that followed her? Well, that's a big if, assuming that because she would have been the lowest priority for modernization, if she's going in for modernization at all, it'll be right at the end of the 30s, once all the others have either gone through the modernizations or are towards the end of their time period. She is a much more limited design. The best I think you could probably do with that would be similar to what they did to the Dorias and Cavours, except you'd be remove one triple turret, but that takes you down to 9 guns. I think if it was up to me, I don't know if the Italians themselves would have agreed and done this, but if it was up to me and I absolutely had to modernize Dante Alighieri in some way, shape or form for World War II, I would probably remove one of the triple turrets. Obviously she's got more Gangot style out, probably the one immediately behind the forward superstructure. That would allow me to completely redo her propulsion, and I would redo it in a really big way, do a bow extension like you've done with the Dorias and Cavours, but in this case, and obviously replace the secondaries with modern secondaries. But because proportionally you're getting rid of more guns and a greater amount of weight, in theory you could push the ship to quite a significant speed, at which point I would maybe even look at having her as a cruiser flotilla leader rather than a battleship, because realistically 912 or reboard 12.6-inch guns and a relatively questionable armor belt is not really going to do a huge amount on the front lines. I mean, I know the Cavors are not really that much more heavily armed, but you know, I think given the layout of Dante Alighieri with a completely modernized propulsion system, you might be able to get her to hit 30 plus knots, at which point I'd use her as a super cruiser rather than a battleship. Cat2V asks, if Hood's machinery gives up the Ghosts a few days before Bismarck sails, rendering her unavailable for that operation, how does Admiral Tovey adjust his deployment with one less capital ship available? Does this allow Bismarck to break through the Denmark Strait to conduct raiding, or does it lead to her being sunk far earlier, or both? It probably leads to her being sunk considerably earlier, actually, because if Hood is out and you've got Prince Eugen and Bismarck going there, Tovey doesn't really have much of a choice but to send King George V in Hood's place, and King George V is a much more worked up ship than Prince of Wales. Prince of Wales is going to have to come as well, and if King George V and Prince of Wales are going to come, which means Tovey is going with them, because obviously King George V is his flagship, then at that point you may as well drag Victorious with you, along for the ride, which means that you're going to have carrier recon to find them, potentially carrier torpedo strikes going in before the battleships close in, and then of course you have two King George V's, considerably more heavily armoured and with deeper belts, so plunging shots not so much of a problem if that particular scenario lines up anyway. And obviously, as I said, King George V, much more worked up ship, has the same advanced fire control that Prince of Wales does. So between two King George V's and Victorious and airstrikes, I think Bismarck's career probably ends at Denmark Strait or shortly thereafter. So either she, does a stand-up fight and ends up with Suffolk and Norfolk piling in onto Prince Eugen, Victorious dropping more torpedoes on the scene, and she just gets overwhelmed and sunk there and then, or potentially she gets badly damaged and runs off, but with Victorious keeping tabs on her and just keeps dropping torpedoes on her until she's slowed down enough to be shot up once more by the chasing British. So all in all, yeah, Hood's machinery giving up is probably better for the Royal Navy than what happened historically. Graham William Kidd says, I'm still watching through the low hundreds dry docks, and in one of those you discussed how the Dutch Navy almost purchased 3 or 4 Queen Elizabeth class or style ships, and how these refitted ships would change to World War II. This leads me to ask, which non-major combatant World War II Navy, i.e. not the Japanese, Royal, US, German, Italian or French navies, if affected by a few pre-war butterflies of the planned but never implemented type, could have had the most impact on World War II? What were the butterflies that never flew, and what are a few examples of the changes they could have wrought in World War II? Well, if you exclude those navies, you didn't exclude the Russians. So, if you don't have the Russian Revolution, Soviet Revolution, or you do but it fails, so you have in either way a monarchical imperial Russia hangs around, or you have the Soviet Revolution and they don't decide that having knowledge of designing ships is a bourgeoisie concept and execute most of their ship designers, and experienced naval officers for that matter, then the Russian Navy could be considerably more powerful than it was historically. It's not really going to exert a huge amount of influence on the war in the North Sea or the Atlantic, but it could cause some fairly significant issues for the Germans in the Baltic, at least for a while. I mean, it depends how much the Luftwaffe gets at them during Barbarossa. Of course, you've got the Dutch with their potential battle cruisers or other ship purchases, which could have changed quite a lot of things. Going far, far back, of course, you've got whether or not Canada would have bought their Queen Elizabeth, and would they have maintained them during the interwar period? I mean, probably not, but they could have sold them back to the British to replace older ships or something. You've got... See, the thing is, then you're starting to run out of significantly sized navies. What else could you have? I mean, you've got, things like the Greek Navy, the Ottoman Navy, the Australian Navy, etc. But aside from, they have a few more modern ships around, which allows them to offer some more resistance, or in the Australian Navy's case, be a bit more helpful, or in the Ottoman's case, be a bit more menacing, because they don't get directly involved. There's not a huge amount of effect those changes are going to make, unless you get butterflies on butterflies. So, if the Greeks have more modern destroyers, do they sortie and manage to do something unspeakable to the Regia Mariner randomly? That kind of thing. But that's the kind of stuff that as I say, is a butterfly on a butterfly. So outside of the Dutch, I think that's probably about it. I mean, if the Poles got their hands on something bigger like they wanted to, they would obviously cause quite a bit of damage with that, but it would probably be a glorious last stand in Gdynia rather than anything else. Taking on the German pre-dreadnoughts. Yeah, people pointing out China. Well, China's in the middle of a civil war, so honestly, where you've got nationalist Chinese and communist Chinese, and the Japanese having a crack at them a lot sooner than 1939, realistically, any Chinese plans for ships in the interwar period, they probably would have been used to sink each other, or been very quickly picked off by the Japanese early on in the Sino-Japanese War, season whatever. Lord Nelson asks, the battle at Jutland turns into a disaster when Scheer sacrifices the German 2nd Battle Squadron to lure Beatty into a trap. Most of the German Deutschlands are lost in a matter of an hour, but then the trap snaps shut, and the battlecruiser fleet, including 5th Battle Squadron, is quickly overwhelmed by the main German battle line. To add insult to injury, Beatty's wrong signals have persuaded Jellicoe to abandon formation in favour of a general chase, leading to 2 short, sharp engagements that see the British 1st and 4th Divisions being lost in exchange for relatively light damage to the German battle line. Okay, well, we're getting into a little bit of a magical territory at this point. Fine. For Scheer, the battle comes at a cost, though, as the Kaiser resents the sacrifice of the Deutschlands. Therefore, Admiral von Drachenfels is quickly put in Scheer's place as head of the High Seas Fleet and given free rein to exploit Scheer's victory. Well, pretty much. Actually, we kind of answered a similar question further up the line. I mean, the amount of damage that the 5th Battle Squadron is going to put out in going down, even if we ignore the battle cruisers, plus the relative paucity of German dreadnoughts, plus the fact that the British Grand Fleet is pretty good at reacting, means unfortunately there's the first bit, yeah, I can get, but even in a general chase, the British hauling into some form of battle line, it's not going to cost them half the Grand Fleet. But nonetheless, if we assume that this goes down for whatever reason as historical, then, well, in this case, you've got considerably more losses to the Grand Fleet than in the previous question, at which point my answer would just be a modification of previous, which is essentially just lock down the channel. Put a blockading force somewhere near Harwich. Obviously, you're going to have to deal with the Harwich force, but put a blockading force somewhere between the Medway and the Netherlands, and then send in your faster, light, and to a certain extent possibly some of your expendable forces as well, and completely dominate the channel, cut off the British Army from all resupply, and wait. And at that point, you just wait for the British to go, okay, fine, we give in. So that's 20 out of 25. So So we've got 5 more alternate history questions. Then we go through the Patreon question, the super chats, and then we're on to everybody else down there in the comments. So not doing too badly. It seems we were answering questions at the rate of about 10 an hour. No, 20 an hour, sorry. 10 every half hour. Sapper Ninja. HMS Conqueror, the Orion class battleship from World War One, sorry, versus USS Phoenix, aka General Belgrano. Phoenix is faster firing, and has better fire control, whereas Conqueror has a slight edge in range and a hideous edge in kill power. If we're assuming World War I configured Conqueror versus World War II configured Phoenix, well, see, this is going to be a very interesting one, because Phoenix is quite capable of rendering Conqueror combat incapable at range, because, you know, World War II fire control. So she can shoot up Conqueror quite easily beyond a range at which Conqueror can effectively reply outside of sheer luck. However, with most scenarios like this, then once you've rendered the ship incapable of firing back except at very close range, you would close in and finish it with torpedoes, except of course Phoenix is a Brooklyn class, which means she doesn't have torpedoes, which means the only way for her to finish off Conqueror is either to hope she'd set it on fire and keep that fire going with occasional salvos, or to try and sneak up closer in under the cover of night to try and get to a range where her 6-inch guns might be able to punch through Conqueror's armoured or main armoured portion, because of course you can riddle the ends of Conqueror, but that's not going to sink her as if the Citadel remains unbreached. And of course, if you do sneak close, then there's a chance that Conqueror could still execute you with 13.5-inch guns. So yeah, in theory, in terms of mission kill, you know, we've rendered the enemy incapable of combat and we're now just going to leave. Yeah, Phoenix could definitely do that. The slightly more problematic bit is going to be actually finishing off Conqueror without eating a 13.5-inch shell or two to the face, thanks to that lack of torpedoes. Knight 6831 pointing out, Conqueror does have torpedoes. Yeah, true, but World War I battleship underwater tubes firing torpedoes, I mean, you might get lucky, but I don't think Phoenix is going to be quite that close. And even if she was, they'd hear it on hydrophones, and it's only the one. Jeffrey Connolly asks, had John Paul Jones and his crew somehow managed a second attack Okay, this is just... Had John Paul Jones's crew somehow managed a second attack on the Medway and stolen a British first or even second rate, how much of a slap in the face would this be to the Royal Navy internationally? And could you see it result in a Bismarck-style frenzy to capture or destroy the ship? Well, it's the Dutch that attacked the Medway. Yeah, I'm not sure about how to answer that, because, as I say, it's the Dutch that attacked the Medway and stole ships. John Paul Jones and crew didn't manage to attack a major British fleet anchorage. They attacked a convoy. And also, unlike the Dutch fleet, they don't have the firepower. So even if we assume that somehow they managed to do a Pirates of the Caribbean style escapade and run off with a first or second rate, they do not have anything close to the firepower to stop the rest of the British ships in the vicinity chasing them down. So yeah, it would be a Bismarck-style frenzy to capture or destroy the ship, but it would be a fairly short frenzy, because yeah, they'd have to rely on sneaking rather than incapacitating everybody if they were going to even start to come and try that. Randwick78, a couple of Patreon Drydocks ago, you mistook my question for a better one. So I've decided to ask it this time around. What if the battle cruiser was included as a separate class of capital ship in the Washington Treaty? Battlecruiser being defined as a vessel with a design speed of more than 27 knots, armed with guns of no greater than 14 inches, limited to 35,000 tons. There are exceptions allowed for renown and repulse if the Royal Navy wishes to take it. The Japanese are allowed to scrap 2 Congos and build 1 Amagi and a second new battlecruiser. The Royal and US Navies are allowed 200,000 tons of battlecruisers. Japan is permitted 120,000 tons, while France and Italy are able to argue their tonnage up to 60,000 tons. The tonnage for battleships is also reduced by these amounts from their historic allowances. Who are the winners and losers in this timeline, both in short and long terms? Would renown and repulse survive? Does the Royal Navy want to build 2 more modern battlecruisers? So the US Navy doesn't have quite as large a technological advantage. Which battleships historically would be eliminated by this change to the treaty? That's a lot of tonnage for battle cruisers. Let me just check the exact figures. Where's the text of the Washington Naval Treaty? There it is. Right, yeah, so Britain and the US have 525,000 tons historically. If you're looking at reducing that by 200,000 tons, so you've got 325,000 tons left. I mean, that's 10 capital ships, roughly, because obviously most capital ships are under 35 already. So, I mean, that would allow the British to keep the Revenges and the Queen Elizabeth as their capital ships, as their battleships. Hood, Renown, and Repulse would have to be lumped in as battle cruisers, because if Hood is treated as a battleship, that's going to cause a lot of complications. So 200,000 tons, and then you've got Hood, Renown, and Repulse taking up about half of that. So you've got essentially space, roughly speaking, for 3 additional battle cruisers. The British, I don't think they'd be massively upset. You could get 3 F3s. I mean, you wouldn't have anything that's 16-inch, but 3 F3s is not a bad consolation prize. The Americans are in a bit more of a pickle. I mean, yeah, okay, 200,000 tons. They don't have any battle cruisers historically. The problem is they don't have any battle cruisers historically. So if they've got, so they're going to keep 3 Colorados, Tennessees, and the New Mexicos. 8. Pennsylvania's. Okay, so the Nevadas, Arkansas, and so basically all the 12-inch ships, Texas, New York, and the Nevadas are all going to have to go. So technically speaking, that might put the US at a slight advantage over the Royal Navy, because the Royal Navy has Renown, Repulse, and Hood, plus these 3 F3s, potentially with 14-inch guns, because they've got this arbitrary gun limit, which might give you a bit more speed. But the US now can build 200,000 tons, or about approximately 6 battle cruisers brand new. So that's, I mean, it depends what the US builds. If they build something with, armor at all, they have an advantage. If they try and build 6 mini Lexingtons, that's going to be a bit silly, because they might try and do that, actually, save weight by not having armor to get 33,300 tons instead of 35,000 ton. That would put them at a bit of a disadvantage in the interwar period, albeit 6 fast battle cruiser type vessels wouldn't make too bad carrier escorts in Second World War. Yeah, France and Italy are just going to not do anything until the 30s anyway because they don't have the money. And Japan, 120,000 tons is, what's that divided by 35? That gives them 3 and a bit battle cruisers, or 30,000 tons if they want to have 4. Yeah, I mean the Japanese getting Amagi, retaining the Congos, rotating 2 Congos. The Japanese might do okay. I think the British do the best out of it if the Americans go with mini Lexingtons. If the Americans scrap the idea of mini Lexingtons and then just build 6 actually halfway decent armored battle cruisers, they're the ones who are going to get that advantage. Knight 6831 pointing out that the British probably wouldn't accept it. Yeah, probably not, but the question is the question. So we're assuming, caveat of the question, that they somehow try and make it work. I mean, yeah. Net, the US probably also gains from just having modern, fast capital ships instead of much older, slower, less capable standards and pre-standards. And they've just got the more recent standards. Donovan Lawler asks, the Dark Seas channel recently did a what if Bismarck hunt in 1943 with the US Navy and the Iowas. I'm not asking for a reaction or a review, good. Otherwise I might just have to hunt you down. Just asking, in your opinion, what would a US Navy Bismarck hunt look like? I mean, in 43? I mean, in 43, you'd be talking about either putting New Jersey out there right after her commissioning, or potentially pulling Iowa off Arctic convoy duty. So, I mean, realistically, I think possibly the most realistic scenario I could come up with for that would be, I mean, Bismarck's dead by this point, so let's say Tirpitz sails while Iowa is on Arctic convoy duty. She's the last US battleship to do that. But instead of going after the Arctic convoys, Tirpitz does something completely unexpected and just hightails it for the Atlantic, because you're not going to get a chase in the Arctic Ocean. That's just dumb. So Tirpitz just goes Leroy Jenkins out to the Atlantic, and everyone's kind of going, what the? Now, of course, the British do have ships that can pursue, but they are slower. Iowa is faster than Tirpitz, so Iowa would probably get told, right, turn around, you're heading that way. British and American aircraft in Iceland and so forth would be monitoring the progress of Bismarck, or Tirpitz in this case, at which point the British would be scrambling to redeploy assets to try and catch her and meet her from ahead. Iowa would be steaming hard to catch up from behind, and of course Iowa has the luxury of not only being faster, but also being able to just go hell for leather, because she can, if absolutely necessary, be met by a tanker. Bismarck or Tirpitz doesn't know that, so again, British and American aircraft based in Iceland, or potentially on carriers that might also be hightailing it into the area, would be trying to slow Tirpitz down. But given the sheer power of Iowa and potentially what's happened, memories of what happened to Hood, I think probably what the British would be trying to do would be essentially to herd or cripple Tirpitz in such a way that Iowa gets to catch up, and then the British can just do a holding pattern, much like they did with the destroyers in the night before Bismarck was historically engaged, so that come dawn, or maybe even at that point with radar pre-dawn, the British then move in from kind of, roughly speaking, ahead of where Tirpitz was going, whilst Iowa comes in from behind, and Tirpitz is pinned on all sides by ferocious incoming gunfire, at which point I guess it becomes a comparison exercise in whether the British idea of getting in close or the American idea of long-range gunnery kills Tirpitz faster. And of course, Frank Barnwell pointing out that Iowa would be able to also use her own scout aircraft once she gets a bit closer, assuming that the Atlantic is kind enough to allow you to do that, which is not necessarily always guaranteed. Alec Ruby asks, I know it's well outside the scope of the channel, but say the Royal Navy kept Vanguard around like the US Navy kept the Iowas around and modernized them in the 70s. What do you think it would look like, and would it possibly dissuade the Argentinians for a little while from the Falklands War? I'm not sure if Vanguard alone would dissuade the Argentinians. It might do. It's big and impressive. But in the early 1980s calculus, it would not be seen as quite as formidable an asset as, let's say, Ark Royal. What would it look like? I mean, it really depends on the degree of modernization that occurs in the 70s. It could look very like she did when she went into reserve. You could have huge amounts of, well, not huge amounts. You could have a bunch of Seacat launchers having replaced some or all of the secondary battery. I think more likely you would have the superstructure modified. Britain doesn't have a Tomahawk alike. So you probably have the superstructure modified, obviously, to support the new electronics. I have a feeling, given the relative cheapness of the British government in the 70s, what you would probably see is the removal of the super-firing 5.25s, and maybe they bolt some quad Exocet launchers where the aft one was, and maybe put some Seacat launchers or some other surface-to-air missile launchers where the forward super-firing ones were, and keep the lower super-firing ones just for AA purposes. Most of the 40 mils are going to be stripped off. I mean, some lunatic might try and convert her into a semi-Harrier carrier, but, you know, like they were thinking of doing to the Iowas. But that's much, much more expensive. So I think you're most likely to just see Vanguard with her 15-inch guns, a handful of point defense missiles and some Exocets, and some of the 5.25s still around. That's probably what the 1970s Royal Navy could afford or would be allowed to afford. Right, so that's all of the alternate history questions from Drydocks 279 and 283, which now means I can start trying to make inroads on the super chats. Where's that gone? There we go. Right, so Captain Charlemagne Models asks, in the game World of Warships, HMS Rook is based off of the J3 battlecruiser designs. Could you see ships being built like they are in World of Warships, and what names would you use for 2 more ships? I mean, yeah, the Rook design was something the Royal Navy seriously considered as part of its design lineage. Could you see the ships being built? Well, not in the historical era that they were considering, because they would be too large. You'd need something like F3 to be built instead of the Nelsons. The J3 design just displaces too much. But if for whatever reason they were, what would we go for? I mean, you're talking about an Anglo-Dutch war admiral. So if we went with other Anglo-Dutch war admirals, I mean, the Royal Navy does like using Blake. They don't so much like using Monk or Bing. Certainly, definitely not for battleships or battle cruisers. I mean, to be honest, most likely, given that they're admirals, they probably would have just gone with Anson, some combination of Anson, Howe, Nelson, Rodney. I mean, obviously they used Nelson and Rodney historically, but if they're building J3s instead, then presumably that hasn't happened. So yeah, it would probably just be other admirals names. Unfortunately, the Royal Navy, when they don't use a name, they like kicking it down the road to the next name. So originally, you would have had Anson, Howe, and Rodney being the second, third, and fourth admiral class, and when that didn't happen, Rodney's name got kicked down the line to the next class of ships. They chose Nelson for that class because they wanted a nice, strong leading class name. And then, of course, Anson and Howe got kicked down the road to the next class of ships, which was the King George V. So, yeah, probably. I mean, Rook, Anson, Howe. Yeah, it was probably about right, I would guess. If they're F3s, much more likely to be built. BR Class 47 asks, would it have been a good and feasible idea to fit the King George V class ships with second-hand guns, Vanguard style, but in triple turrets, i.e. 3 guns per turret, either when built or post-World War II refit? Post-World War II refit, no. The 15-inch 42, by that stage, it doesn't offer a huge amount more than the 14-inch does, and Britain doesn't have the money for it. When built, with the big pool of 15-inch 42s they've got, yeah, they could do so. They pretty much the only reason they didn't go with a 15-inch option, to be honest, was because they wanted to support their own proposal for 14-inch being the limit at Second London. If they don't do that, if they either just say leave it at 16 or maybe ask for it to be reduced to 15, well, they were going to build new 15-inch guns anyway, 15-inch 45 guns. If they'd wanted to add more battleships to that building process, then yeah, they could have recycled 15-inch 42s as well. But it wasn't just guns, it was also armour production that limited initial British capital ship construction in the mid-30s. So feasible, yes, but practical, probably not. It could have been done, but I don't think they would have. I think they would have rather just built the new 15-inch 45s. Mike Lima 777 says, my super chat got missed last Drydock. I do apologise. In late 1939, the Free Polish Navy gets the manpower and resources to run their original fleet plus one more ship. What would be the most terrifying ship to give to the Poles? What would be the most terrifying ship to give to the Poles? oh, you're not going to like this. Give them Kitakami in her torpedo form. No one's going to see that coming. And the Germans certainly aren't going to see it coming. Can you imagine the Poles being given dozens and dozens and dozens of long lances and being told, hey guys, the Germans are coming for you. What would you like to do in close confined waters and then at night with radar against German battleships? Is that, the worst torpedo salvo in the history of the world from the perspective of it being fired at someone? Yes, it is. Yeah. Give the Poles a Kitakami, and excessive torpedo launchers on a single ship are going to be added to the Geneva Convention pretty darn soon. Sapper Ninja asks, unfortunately I can't stay as work starts soon. Well, actually, that's the Phoenix Conqueror question from the alternate history, so I guess we have answered that. Nosdormu89 asks, now that I've played a hybrid in World of Warships, I have to ask, why were they considered at all? Who thought it was a good idea, and why were they not shuffled off somewhere like the Naval Defense District of Montana? So this is hybrid carrier battleships. Partially, it was because of the treaty restrictions. If you can only have a certain number of ships, you try and get the most flexibility out of those ships. And certainly at the time, they were being most seriously considered. Obviously, you don't have radar, so you want some way of scouting at long distances. And the threat of aircraft, while it is appreciated, isn't quite as great as it would be later on. So having only a few aircraft isn't necessarily seen as a massive detriment. And, well, to be honest, the vast majority of hybrid planned ships were hybrid cruiser carriers, which make a little bit more sense in an era before radar than hybrid carrier battleships. But I think the general reasoning was that if the carrier battleship ends up in combat, in theory, it should have all of its aircraft up in the air doing combat things, which would mean, in theory, they would be less flammable. But yeah, it's basically an artifact of how, with a treaty-restricted fleet, do we get the maximum benefit in a world without radar? Because as the possibility of radar starts to come along, well, and the somewhat flammable nature of carriers becomes more and more apparent, you start to see these designs die out very, very fast. John Doe asks, do you have any book recommendations for export destroyer designs that never were, such as the Thornycroft and Vickers designs mentioned by Friedman in his works? I'm in Australia, so cannot easily access original research sources used. Ooh, that is a difficult one. Let me just check one of my suspicions. No, unfortunately, Edgar J. March's British Destroyers covers just British destroyers. At the size it was, I was kind of hoping it might cover other stuff. See, if you'd asked for export destroyer designs, that I could find a few works for. Export destroyer designs that never were, i.e. ones that were proposed, that I don't think, off the top of my head, I don't think anyone's actually written any significant works on that. Usually, because apart from anything, the information is pretty sparse. Possibly one of the better options would be to drop me a message either via Discord or email. And if you've got some specific ones that are mentioned in Friedman, then drop me an email and I might be able to pull information from the archives. But as far as I'm aware, outside of maybe some random articles somewhere, I don't think there's actually the not taken up export destroyer designs actually tabulated in any particular book. So yeah, sorry about that. If anyone knows of such a book, please let me know, because I want a copy as well. But I don't think anyone's actually written that. Rebel Skvirl asks, just how feasible would the torpedo battleship proposed by the US Navy actually be in a battle line engagement, assuming a class of 4 such ships, or 2 two-ship subclasses? I mean, it depends which torpedo battleship you're talking about. As I covered in the 5-minute guide on torpedo battleships, there were quite a few different torpedo battleship proposals, pre-Dreadnought, early Dreadnought, and Super Dreadnought era ones. Overall, the pre-Dreadnought ones were probably the most feasible, in part because of the lack of number of guns and lack of advanced fire control in most of the pre-Dreadnought era. The early Dreadnought versions were probably the ones that weren't going to work out much at all, and then the later ones you start to swing back and forth between essentially pure torpedo battleship and almost a small battle cruiser, just with a lot of torpedo launchers relative for a capital ship. Yeah, the thing is, as speed and firepower of ships increases, they become less and less feasible. As kind of ships to finish off crippled ships, they might work, but you need a lot of ships to be able to justify a ship of that nature. I think the pre-Dreadnought torpedo battleships, the early ones, would probably be the most feasible for the US battle line, and they did actually wargame them with a certain degree of success. Information Mimic, asking a question about a theoretical album. Yes, there is a way to send that album, which again is basically drop me a message via Discord or email, and I will be able to provide you with a postal address. Dan Calvin says, thank you for the great work. Thank you very much. Mike Lima Ncept 777 asks, what if Taffy 3 appeared off of Port Moresby a week before the Battle of the Java Sea? Could ABDA command survive? And how might the extra ships and planes affect the war? Bonus with what if the other Taffys appear? If Taffy 3 appears and reinforces ABDA command a week earlier, they definitely could turn the Battle of Java Sea. There's a lot of aircraft on Taffy 3, including a fair number of strike aircraft. Granted, they don't have a huge number of anti-ship munitions, but they're not going to need a huge amount, considering we're talking about late 41, early 42 Japanese anti-aircraft capabilities. The single biggest problem with Taffy 3 or any of the other Taffys is going to be their relatively limited top speed and whether or not they can keep up with the Allied forces. But even if, to be honest, the sheer advantage of having a bunch of escort carriers at that point, the ABDA command forces will probably quite happily slow down in order to, to have that air support. And of course, you've got loads of fighters for recon. You've got the destroyers and destroyer escorts with radar, so they can scout and are fairly powerful ships in and of their own right. So yeah, that would turn the Battle of Java Sea. As far as how the ships and planes are going to affect the rest of the war, not so much by their sheer presence, other than some potentially significantly bad turnarounds for the Japanese in the early part of the campaign down in the Southern Pacific, although they might just send the Kido Butai to try and deal with that. Their biggest impact is going to be when they get back home, because you're essentially handing the Allies, what would it be, 3 years technological progress on radar, and that's, it's not a gap, it's not a technological gap they can't fill. So they could take apart say, Johnston's radar and go, right, yep, okay, fine, we understand how that advance has been made, and suddenly the Allies have skipped. Well, once you've taken into account the reverse engineering, they essentially skip ahead 2 years of radar development. And the same thing with the aircraft. Okay, they're FM2 Wildcats and so forth, but, you know, late era Wildcats and Avengers are going to give some understandable and relatively quickly reverse engineerable advantages to the Allies in terms of their aircraft and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, you know, the Taffy 3 or Taffy 1 and 2 crew's knowledge of what's going to happen in the next few years will be pretty disruptive as well. Hendog 1000 asks, we all know Halsey was out of Midway due to illness. What if Halsey suffers complications causing him to have to leave naval service? How does the rest of the war go now for the US, and who takes Halsey's place? Well, really at that point the US, given that you're talking about post Midway, essentially I think at that point they have to send Fletcher. Well, not have to send Fletcher. They'll have to use Spruance and Fletcher. Either Spruance stays with the Central Pacific Advance and Fletcher takes Halsey's place, or Spruance gets sent in place of Halsey, and Fletcher then ends up being the Admiral in command of the Central Pacific push. Now that's an interesting one, because Halsey's ability to invigorate everybody with his attack is probably unparalleled amongst the US flag officer staff in 1943. But then, with either Spruance or Fletcher in place of Halsey for the rest of the war, you're probably not going to run into Typhoons, Cobra and Viper, amongst other things. And given both Spruance and Fletcher had extremely cold-blooded analytical ways of destroying the enemy, and given both of them really liked finding the enemy and establishing their strength with search aircraft, it's entirely possible that, you know, they're not going to get fooled by the Japanese decoys for Battle of Cape Engano, and Kurita might run straight into the majority of the US fleet as they come through the straits, which would be highly amusing. Magister Militum asks, any luck convincing USNI to reprint the 882-page Japanese Cruisers Bible by Eric Lacroix and Linton Wells? There is some progress on that, so watch this space. Actually, I need to get back to Mr. Wells, who I've been communicating with. I just haven't had the time recently to answer many emails, but I do need to do that later this week. So yes, there is some progress, so just watch this space again. Captain Charlemagne Models asks, how much weight savings could the Lexington class have gained for armour if they'd used steam turbines instead of the turboelectric drive? Given the space and weight savings, I think you probably could have gotten them up to about 10 inches of belt armour. It still wouldn't be brilliant in a world of 16-inch guns, but it would be something. Yeah, I would ballpark it at buying you about 3 inches of belt armor across the vitals. But obviously, for exact details, we'd have to look up. There'd be a whole series of complicated calculations to work out. Okay, here's the weight of machinery, here's the weight of the armor, here's the relative weight of machinery when the US Navy was doing comparison designs in the late 20s and early 30s. Therefore, this is likely to be the savings in machinery, and therefore we can then apply that to the armor, which we then have to split down into how much of that overall weight of armor is the belt and how much is the deck, and so on and so forth. So that's a very complicated set of equations, but my ballpark would probably be 2 or 3 more inches onto the belt, which would give you 9 to 10 inches, which I say it's still definitely not great. And if you're expecting to go into a world where everyone's slinging 16-inch guns at each other, or the shells from 16-inch guns, but it's considerably better than what they had. Scott Lee asks, Mers El Kabir, how does the battle go if the French fleet sortied and fought Somerville in the Western Mediterranean compared to the attack that happened historically? It depends when they sortie, because they have no particular reason to sortie until Somerville shows up and gives them their ultimatum. If they then try and do that with the British having all their guns aimed squarely at them, it goes very badly for them, because Ark Royal can launch considerably more air attacks, and the British have kind of, there's a choke point to get out of Mers El Kabir harbour. The British can deluge that with shells whilst being fairly mobile, and the French ships are still working up to try and get out. If they've sortied before Somerville shows up for whatever reason, then there's not a huge reason for them to fight. They've got a speed advantage because of some of the slower ships that Somerville has with him, so they would just leave for Toulon. And to be honest, even if they were at sea and thought about confronting Somerville, although on paper Dunkirk and Strasbourg are very, very serious threats to pretty much every ship in the British force, the French would be very well aware that, one, they don't have any real reply to Ark Royal's air attacks, and the French are constrained by the fact they have much older ships with them speed-wise, so if they want to have a battle line fight going, they're going to take some fairly serious losses, even if they manage to inflict serious losses as well, which, I don't think they'd want to. I think they'd just go, we're out, we're off to Toulon. If they did fight, it's going to be very, very messy, because the British have the bigger guns, the French have more ships, and you can't really underestimate that 13-inch gun on Dunkirk and Strasbourg, but then the British have carrier support. It's another one of these things of run the scenario a dozen times, get a dozen different results. Matthew Hutnick asks, I think the topic of plushies for Mini-Drac came up in a previous live stream and got me thinking. There's a company called Makeship that works with creators to sell custom plushies. Would you make one? Sure, if it's decent value. I mean, Mrs. Track has sketched out a plushie sea mine before. That might be one thing to go for. I'll have to have a look at those. It depends on what would be the market for would there be a market for a plushie sea mine? I suspect some people would go for it. Alternate historian Turtle Duck, if Mario if Mario, the Italian guy in East Africa, was not in East Africa, and you can station him in any other habitat or area to wreck that harbour, where would you put him to cause the Allies the most pain? Are we assuming Axis harbours that they're taking over? Because obviously if he's in an Allied harbour, they'd just be like, no, you're not allowed to. If we're talking about harbours the Allies would be taking, and him wrecking them thoroughly would cause the Allies a lot of trouble, Tobruk, actually, I think, would be the one I'd put him in, because everyone fought back and forth over Tobruk in the desert because it was kind of a supply linchpin. If during one of the times Tobruk falls, good old Mario is there to completely wreck the place, it is going to very significantly affect the British and other Allied forces' ability to operate much further west of that in the desert, because they're going to have extremely long supply lines going back considerably further than they did historically. Animal 16365. What would be the outcome of the US Navy if Lee and King were to swap places with... So basically, Admiral King is in place of Admiral Lee. Well, I mean, King is a good admiral. He's not the gunnery expert that Lee is. He is fairly aggressive, though. But see, the thing is, King loves his carriers by the 1930s. If Lee is now the fleet admiral, but King is a rear admiral, I think, if anything, King would probably be deployed to the carriers. I don't know, maybe at that point, given that Spruance historically, I mean, okay, Midway aside, historically up until that point had been a battleship and cruiser guy, maybe then Spruance gets put in charge of Washington and South Dakota. King gets assigned to the Central Pacific to lead the carriers, and Lee is confused, wondering how he managed to jump several pay grades sitting in Washington. John Thomas asks, post-war, you fix the travesty of no Pearl Harbor battleships being saved. Which do you pick? I choose West Virginia since she's the last to hit a capital ship. Yeah, I'd have to agree with it. I'd have to agree with that. Of the battleships that were at Pearl Harbor, although West Virginia doesn't have a huge battle history because she took so long to refit, she does have a battle history, and as you said, she has Surigao Strait under her belt. And she actually is also an extremely interesting ship because, of course, she is a late-stage super dreadnought, a Colorado class, but completely modernized, which also means from a museum ship perspective, she's in the best, probably in one of the best operational shapes to be preserved as a museum ship as opposed to being thoroughly worn out. Most of the others are either, from a sort of a selling point, essentially just, okay, here's another similar vessel, but with with maybe slightly more combat history, but less modernization, and not quite as much of a salvage story as West Virginia. About the only competitor I could see to that would be maybe Pennsylvania, because she's the sister ship to Arizona, and she does have the whole nearly being sunk at the end of the war thing to her as well. Texas Anlashock asks, of the 5 most pivotal / famous naval battles, what would you pick as the soundtrack for each of them? Well, you've got to pick the 5 most pivotal and famous naval battles to start with, which is going to be a bit of an ask. The epic remix of the final... I mean, actually... See, the problem is when you say pivotal or famous, that rather limits my choices compared to what I would like to do battle-wise. Okay, so let's say, what's pivotal? Philippine Sea, Jutland, Trafalgar, Lepanto, maybe the Spanish Armada. Then soundtracks. What would you use as soundtracks? That's a very good question. See, for Trafalgar, because everything's happening relatively slowly, you need something, lots of deep bass and drums, a bit like the original intro music, actually, for the 5-minute guides. For Lepanto, I think you could probably adapt one of the Sabaton songs about the Crusades or that kind of period, because it's pretty much religious death match. Armada is kind of a religious death match, but not quite as vicious as Lepanto. I think for the Armada, you could probably take something from Two Steps from Hell's discography. I'm not sure what to do with Jutland. I'm not sure what to do with Jutland or Philippine Sea. There are a lot of options. Because Jutland, you want something a little bit faster than Trafalgar, but it's still quite... You need something still quite epic. Philippine Sea, you could be a lot more active and fast because you've got aircraft flying around really fast, etc. Yeah, that's a good... I think I'd have to sit down and take a lot longer look at that, to be perfectly honest. Mike Lima 777 asks, if Rear Admiral Scott had survived Guadalcanal, might more scrutiny have fallen on Callahan's decision before the battle, and what if Callahan also survives? If Scott survives Guadalcanal, he's well, at some point he's going to have to take command and try and somewhat rescue the situation. At which point, how Callahan ended up dead and what Scott would have done otherwise, that will occur. If Scott and Callahan survive, on the one hand, they have won, which is that's going to put both of their stars up in the world. But given the cost and some of the issues that arise, if Callahan also survives, Callahan will probably remain in command of stuff, but I have a feeling he may be side graded off to somewhere where he's not maybe in charge of leading another major battle. Not quite the desk job back in the continental United States that Carlton Wright got, but maybe put in command of more of a support operation, and then Scott, by being present at a notional victory, but not quite as tarred with some of the faulty tactics, would probably go on to be quite a successful cruiser commander. Stoned Abbott. Is that a Ukraine reference on Drac Shelf? Where? I don't do politics. Regardless of what I may or may not think about the situation that's going on at the moment, I don't do politics and force it on people, so I don't know. I mean, I've got an Adeptus Custodes, I've got a Homeworld Mothership, I've got a Reaper, I've got a Swordfish, I've got another Reaper, both from Mass Effect, I've got a Cool to Attack Mothership, I've got I've got Warspite as a mecha. That's quite funny, but I don't think that's anything to do with Ukraine. I've also got the new Homeworld Mothership for when I can find somewhere to put it. It's over there. No, I'm a bit confused by that question. Sorry. Oh, someone says those are just two cases out there from... Oh, those! Oh, that's got an X-Wing on them. No, those are... those got some Battle Fleet Gothic miniatures. Those are plastic cases that have been there forever. Sorry, I was looking at this live screen. I just realized that the live screen count is actually covering those two. I can see how you might think that with the blue and yellow, but those are just boxes for Battle Fleet Gothic. I am not making any political statements on modern politics of any kind because that's the channel policy. As I say, regardless of my own personal thoughts on those matters. Normie asks, if the Scharnhorst had kept her destroyers and had working radar, could North Cape have turned out differently, or could she have at least escaped? Yes, definitely. If she'd still had working radar, she could have seen Duke of York coming and skedaddled, because she almost skedaddled anyway, But if she's, got another 10,000 yards notice that, hey, there's a Socking Great battleship coming your way, she could just pedal to the metal and try and disappear off into the murk. The radar probably would be a lot more useful than the destroyers, because the destroyers were just seasickness machines at that point. BR Class 47 asks, tomorrow, Azure Lane is adding USS Indiana, and she has a scar on her face, which is said to be a reference to Washington colliding with her. Could you tell us a bit more about this incident? Well, I actually plan at some point when I'm doing a extensive history of USS Washington to talk more about it, but in very, very brief terms, you have a refueling operation going on. You actually have at that point, all 8 US fast battleships, all the ones that have been commissioned, because Missouri and Wisconsin have yet to be commissioned. So they're all operating together, and there's a bit of a screw up with station keeping, let's just say, which ends up with Washington going nose first into Indiana. Takes off about 200 feet of Indiana's plating. Washington gets her bow smashed in, and they both have to retire for some repairs, which is why then when you get the truck raids, because this happens at the beginning of February in 1944, so when you get the truck raids, Operation Hailstone, 2.5 weeks-ish later, then they're not there. So you only have 6 fast battleships, at Operation Hailstone, while they're patching up Indiana and Washington. Which is a little bit annoying for Admiral Lee, because, of course, it means he has to transfer his flag as well. But both ships would be repaired and come back in service. Robert Denduven asks, how would Drac look with Centauri hair from Babylon 5? Probably I'd fall over. My hair is actually quite dense and heavy, so the few times I've grown it long, it just kind of sits. I could, in theory, shape it, but it would take, an industrial grade quality of hair gel or something. Who's this? Styling and Profiling Battleships and Barbecue asks, if you're in charge of the Japanese Navy in the first half of 42, do you forego the Indian Ocean raid? Do you hunt down US carriers or cut off Australia? It depends if I've got future knowledge or not. Assuming I don't have future knowledge, because obviously that's a bit of a cheat code. Yeah, the Indian Ocean raid has always struck me as more of a something to do than a serious campaign attempt. So yeah, my general feeling when it comes to smaller navies, and the Japanese Navy in particular, is you can't penny pack it, and that's essentially what they ended up doing, which is why they also lost Coral Sea. So if I was in charge, yeah, I would not do the Indian Ocean raid. I'd just say, yes, it may be ridiculously overkill, but I'm sending the entire Kido Butai, or everything that's operational, because cargo manages to ground itself at one point. I'd send at least Hiryu and Soryu, and with Shikaku and Suikaku. So I'd have at least 4 or 5 fleet carriers going down on the Coral Sea Port Moresby operation, which means I should win the Battle of Coral Sea quite easily, and hopefully with less damage to Shikaku and Suikaku, which in turn means that when Midway comes, in theory, I should be able to field the entire Kido Butai, which will cause some problems, especially since if I've managed to, with the entire Kido Butai at Coral Sea, take down both Yorktown and Saratoga, and Yorktown and Lexington. That means I've now got 6 carriers versus 2 instead of 5 versus 3. Yeah, things bouncing around. Timolo04 says, I love listening to your videos while playing Rome Total War 3. Rule the Waves 3, I think that is. Sorry, Rule the Waves 3. Yep, thank you very much. Christian Franzen asks, could the US Mark 14 torpedo problem have been bypassed by importing UK torpedoes? In theory, assuming the British have enough torpedoes to sell to the Royal Navy, to sell to the Royal Navy. They're the same diameter. Lengthwise might be a slight issue because the US has different length torpedoes compared to the British. But to be perfectly honest, the single biggest issue is being the exploder. Just importing British torpedo warheads with their contact detonators would probably have bypassed the issue without having to import the entire torpedo. Mike Lemus 777. What if Canadian and Polish commandos steal Bismarck and Prince Eugen just as Operation Rheinbund begins? Would anyone be surprised? If you read the line, Canadian and Polish commandos stole German capital ships, especially looking back at the craziness those two nationalities got involved in during most of World War II, most people would just sit there and go, yeah, that tracks. I mean, at the time, people would be utterly shocked. How on earth did they get there, and what did they do? I mean, maybe Canadian, Polish, and Norwegian commandos all stashed themselves away in Norway, and then when Bismarck and Prince Eugen put in for some of them to refuel, obviously Bismarck doesn't refuel, but Prince Eugen refuels, maybe they just show up at night on the pier side, and this vast army of Canadian and Polish and Norwegian commandos just overwhelm and capture them and sail them out. Who knows? How useful would they be? Prince Eugen is almost certain to break down in about 13 seconds after anyone so much as looks at our engineering plant. So less useful. Be a useful technology bed for the British to strip apart and work out, what the latest German technology is. But I think Prince Eugen is much better as a study hulk than as anything else. Bismarck, potentially considerably more useful. Again, got technology on board that they can analyze. Her machinery plant is a little less temperamental than an Admiral Hipper's. I suspect, given that they got Richelieu operational, Bismarck's probably useful enough that they would try, at least give it a good try to get her operational. They'd probably have to send her over to the States, both to have a look over her in peace without the entire Luftwaffe trying to destroy her, and also, much as the Americans manufactured stuff for Richelieu, they probably get tasked with manufacturing stuff for Bismarck. Although I deeply suspect also at that point they might just strip off the entire secondary battery and just replace it with 5-inch 38s to reduce the insanity. Apparently this was the bit where we were talking about music, so I'm just going to pick some of the... Sabaton did a Bismarck video, low-hanging fruit battle at Denmark Strait. Yes, that would be very tempting. However, of course, the question was pivotal battles, and with the best one in the world, Denmark Strait wasn't really pivotal to the Second World War. Famous, perhaps, but not pivotal. Someone said Jutland banana phone. That would be quite funny. Not entirely sure what the relationship is, but it would be hilarious. Honor Guardian, Duel of the Fates for Indefatigable and Amazon against Droit de l'Homme. That's not a bad call, actually. That's a really good one. Of course, Jutland Sabaton did do Dreadnought for, theoretically, the Battle of Jutland. Kind of, that could work. Weirdly enough, I think, actually, Dreadnought is potentially actually fractionally too slow for Jutland. It needs a few more fast peaks. Yes, I know I'm musically critiquing Sabaton, but if you ask. Wagner to all of it, yeah, fine. Jutland, the William Tell Overture, or the 1812 Overture. There's actual cannons in that. Yeah, things going everywhere. Josh Gibson asks, a while ago you spoke about the dangers or lack thereof of diving on Bikini Atoll, the Operation Crossroads Rex. If you were handed a blank check, would diving Bikini Atoll be something you would do? Yes, it definitely would be. But if I had a blank check, there would be a bunch of other places I'd want to dive first to check out the wrecks on. Graham W. Kidd, yes, that is Bundaberg Ginger Beer. It is really nice. Commandant Galileo, which song is better in your opinion, Hearts of Oak or Rule Britannia? Ooh. Hearts of Oak is slightly easier to sing. Rule Britannia has a better chorus for crowds. And I think we've actually now caught up with the super chats. So, I'm just going to put that keyboard down because that keyboard's actually getting quite heavy over the hours. Where are we? We're at 10 past 10. Actually, let me just send a quick message to Mrs. Drack. Right, so now we can, I think probably till at least 11-ish, take questions from the general chat. So let's have a go at that. Mini Drac is asleep, so I'll try and open the next live stream with Mini Drac, but that will probably necessitate me starting it an hour earlier so that Mini Drac is still awake. Right, sorry. Right, okay, so let's pick up. Where are we? Right, Bergman26. Okay, I'm going to start here with questions. So if you have asked a question in the past and it's above the one I'm about to read out and you want it answered, try and write it in the comments again below and we'll try and get to it with as much time as we want. Bergman26, any idea if there'll be any more bilge pumps episodes? There should be in the future. Unfortunately, it's still on hiatus. It's a bit of a prolonged hiatus because initially people were unwell, and it was just a chain of one person unwell, then another, then another, then another, back round again. Then, of course, we went, myself and Dr. Clark and others went off to Scandinavia. Dr. Clark's in the process of moving. Once Dr. Clark has finished his moving process, and so, later this year, then I think bilge pumps will be coming back. We'll probably not do a weekly one. We'll probably do a monthly bilge pumps. But yes, the theoretical intention is to bring bilge pumps back by the end of the year. Admiral Need asks, was there any interest or discussion about saving the Tone, considering it was at Pearl Harbor and survived until the end of the war? There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of interest at the time about preserving Japanese ships that weren't Mikasa. If anything, the Allies basically tended to go, okay, are they vaguely operational? Right, well, they're being used as disarmed, essentially Japanese version of Operation Magic Carpet ships to bring troops back and then getting scrapped. And if they're slightly less operational, potentially a little bit too threatening, then we're sticking them in Bikini Atoll and blowing them up with nukes. Hello, Galactic Wolf. Information Mimic says there was a naval battle between the brig Mercury and two Turkish battleships in 1829. Heroic tales aside, was it possible for a small brig to survive two battleship broadsides without igniting magazines? In 1829, when you're talking about first rates, in theory, it depends how good the first rate's gunnery is. I mean, if the first rates actually hit a brig with two full broadsides, the brig's probably going to be erased from existence, just turned into flying splinters. But if it's either maneuvering very well or the battleship's the first rate's gunnery really, really is terrible, then yeah, if you're not hit, you can survive any arbitrary amount of firepower that's thrown at you. Mike Lee asks, if the R-class were retired and their guns placed in Vanguards, which actually was the plan, would the British be cheeky and reuse R-class names? No. They did actually have plans for different names. So the idea was, because originally the R-class was supposed to be retired and the King George V's were going to be their replacements, and then with the escalating of tensions, they decided to move that to being the King George V's would add to the fleet and the R-class would be retired as the Lions were built. And then as the British efforts to expand their ship production capabilities in the latter part of the 1930s bore fruit, they went from being able to produce 2 battleships worth of armor per year to 3 battleships worth of armor per year. Now, yes, they did bring in armor from Czechoslovakia, or as it was at the time, but that was mostly, as far as I'm aware, homogeneous armor. A lot of it ended up being used in carrier flight decks and so forth. And that was mainly to free up production capacity for the face-hardened armor that the British manufacturers were making. So they now had armor manufacturing capability for 3 battleships a year, but not the gun producing capability for 3 battleships a year, hence Vanguard, because they're like, well, we can build everything else of the battleship, but not the guns, but we use these old guns we've got in stock, fantastic, we can build a ship that turns out to be Vanguard. And then the plan, had there not been a war breaking out, was to continue to build Vanguard or Vanguard successors. And at that point, you would have got to the Lions, and with the R-class then coming out of service, then you could recycle the guns. Because, of course, if you know that you've got the guns, you don't have to worry about ordering the guns the year before the ship's keel is laid down. You can build the ship, launch the ship, and it's only when it gets to the fitting out stage you actually really have to worry about sticking the guns on. So that gives you time to decommission the R's, pull their gun mounts off, modify them to have 30-degree elevation, and then stick them on whatever successor to Vanguard. Luke Riley, can you recommend some sources on the Spanish-American War? Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt's book covering it isn't too bad. There's, where are they? My American shelves. There's a couple of books over there on the Spanish-American War I can recommend as well. Again, for book recommendations, because it's all a bit complicated getting up and moving around while I'm also doing this, drop me an email or Discord message and I can pull some books off the shelf and let you know which ones I would recommend for the Spanish-American War. Medros Opajar asks, what song would you do for the journey of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, though? Oh, the Benny Hill tune. Yeah, Benny Hill for 2nd Pacific Squadron. Ooh, everything's jumped. Where are we? Captain Seafort. I think that's where we left off. Oh, Jutland, Man of War into Glory Ride by Innocent Large Waterfall suggests that. That's not a bad idea, actually, for songs. The music curator, would Bismarck's arrival in Brest have led to the destruction of the Scharnhorst and Prince Eugen? I mean, maybe it would provide the British with even more motivation to carpet bomb the place into oblivion, even more so than they historically did. But then again, they tried to carpet bomb the place into oblivion and they didn't hit the ships. It took a Beaufort to, admittedly, nearly sink an Eisenhower, but still. So it would have led to a lot more bombing. It's kind of roll the dice as to whether any of it would have hit anything, though. Captain Seafort asks, between Iowa as built and a G3 refitted Queen Elizabeth or Valiant style finished in early 43, how would you do the G3 refit? Which would be a better anti-aircraft escort, and which would be better to fight Yamato? Well, I mean, obviously, G3 refit superstructure, replace all the secondaries with 4.5s, and then AA is going to be a mixture of, in 43, mixture of 20mm Oerlikons, octuple pom-poms, and some Bofors. In terms of which would be the better AA escort, ooh, now that's a good one. In 43 with Iowa as built? It's going to come down to the anti-aircraft fire control system. I think with the layout, the G3 would offer a more concentrated anti-aircraft battery, and that would probably be much better at close range. For long-range anti-aircraft, though, the US anti-aircraft fire control system is a bit better, even if they haven't fully got into the late war style heavy AA. Excuse me. The 5-inch 38 paired with the American AA systems compared to high angle control, which is the British version. I mean, the final editions of high angle control aren't bad, but still an Iowa would have a slight advantage at long range anti-aircraft fire, but I think the G3 would do better at close range. Obviously refit G3. Which would be a better ship to fight Yamato? In that case, Iowa as built, fresh out of the yard, or G3 refitted. See, Iowa's guns hit harder. They've both got the same effective forward salvo, because G3 has one turret behind the superstructure. Very, very marginally, I would go G3 refit for two reasons. One, it's got big torpedo launchers. Potentially, that could be something of a deciding factor, even if it's just to make Yamato dodge and ruin its fire control solution. But also, a refit G3 is going to be absolutely packed to the gunnels with the latest and greatest technology. I mean, okay, Iowa kind of is as well, but there is a much higher chance that a refit G3 is going to have a fairly experienced crew that know the ship, or at least know ships like her, which as compared to Iowa, which is completely green and a completely new type of ship. Marginal, because their radar systems, fire control, etc., all going to be fairly similar. But I would just not, because it's more likely to be an experienced crew who know roughly what they're doing with the ship. The G3 refit in early 43 would probably just about edge it as a chance against Yamato. Knight 6831 says, how did the Royal Navy deal with the threat of fuel vapours in aircraft fuel tanks, as British RAF Bomber Command introduced tank inerting systems on their heavy bombers in 1944? Fuel vapours in aircraft fuel tanks, well, partly that was by fueling aircraft just before you launch, rather than, getting them all worked up and running earlier in the arming process. If you're talking about landing, fleet air-arm procedure. Well, I mean, you're talking about smaller tanks, so they're easier to pump out as well. Plus, of course, a good chunk of it is armoured flight decks, armoured hangars to keep them safe from incoming bombs. As far as specific fuel inerting systems for the aircraft, I would have to look that up. The fuel vapor safety measures for the ships I know a lot more about, but for the actual aircraft themselves, I mean, it's also going to vary a little bit on the type of aircraft as well. But I'd have to look up the aircraft specifically. Green Sea Ship says, we still haven't seen the dog yet, have we? Floppy has come up here once or twice, but a while ago. I have a feeling at some point I'm going to have to do a live stream downstairs so that Floppy can come and say hello, rather, because he's a big boy now. Dragging the poor boy upstairs is probably not high on his list of priorities. Texas Analyst says, I still remember one of your videos where Baby Drac was quite audibly snoring. Yeah, that was probably while I was looking after her and didn't realise the microphone pickup could work quite as well as it apparently did. Head and Harley, if you could resurrect any ironclad ship built between 1859 and 1899 as a museum, which ship would you pick? Magenta or Solferino, because two-deck ironclads. They are the most steampunk of ironclads, and they are wonderful. Pin Iowa, I think, says hello from Japan. Well, hello from the UK. Number one Ed Sheeran hater says, if the Royal Navy had not done the Ottomans the courtesy of pointing out the problems with their coastal defences in the Dardanelles and removing said defences from existence, how would the Gallipoli campaign go? Now that's an interesting one, because without the indications of exactly how vulnerable their coastal defences were, then when the Anglo-French fleet shows up to, take over the area, well, they don't know the weakness. The Ottomans aren't quite as aware of the weaknesses. There won't have been quite as much of an imperative to rush the reconstruction and reinforcement with German assistance. So any work, I mean, there probably still would be work done, but it would be less. And there's even a possibility that maybe the minefields wouldn't have been laid or wouldn't be as extensive. So there's a much greater chance that what coast defences there are would be suppressed by the Allied bombardment, or more suppressed than they historically were, which might allow the Gallipoli landings to be a little bit more successful. Now, of course, again, we are talking a hypothetical, so you could have everything goes slightly better but still bogs down, or you could have significant morale collapse from huge amounts of firepower suppressing huge amounts of the defences, which allows a very rapid landward advance, which especially if the minefields, the lines of mines either haven't been laid or have been minimally laid, then the Allied fleet might actually be able to surge through to Constantinople-Istanbul. The only problem there, as I've pointed out before, is what exactly do they do there? Because, yes, the threat of shelling the city is there. Would they follow through with it all, though? That's always been the big question. The last time the Royal Navy was sitting off the coast there, they threatened to and didn't, and the whole thing went to pieces. But, plus, of course, you've got Ottoman destroyers and so forth, and the Allied fleet would be in fairly confined waters, plus you've got the possibility of additional mines being laid later on, so it could go anywhere. But in theory, without that opening bombardment, there is a plausible opportunity for the landings to actually go well enough to at least deliver the Allied net fleet to the Ottoman capital. What happens after that, who knows? 96A31 says, if Illustrious was a 27,000-ton carrier, would she have the 48 pom-poms, 6 octuple mounts, as she did, or would she have 44, 5 octuples, and a quad like Implacable had, or would she have 54 with 6 octuples and a quad? If she was a 27,000-tonner, if she's a 27,000-tonner built in the earlier part of the built in the 1930s rather than 1940s, I suspect she might have 6 she might have 6 octuples and either a quad or 2 quads, as opposed to Implacable, which has slightly fewer 40mm because they're putting on other AA guns as well. So yeah, you'd probably see either an additional quad pom-pom or maybe even a couple of extra octuples put in, because 27,000 tons, you're going to be a substantially larger ship. There'd be more deck space. Lonely Lad asks, could you do a brief ranking on the Scandinavian and Thai coast defense ships, and will there be a video on the Thai ships? If I haven't already done one, there will be a video on the Thai ships at some point, although I vaguely remember covering them. Maybe not in a 5-minute guide, but I do vaguely remember covering them. Outside of that, in 4th place, I would put Norge and Eidsvold, mostly because they were just, by World War II, they hadn't been upgraded, as was kind of shown in the Battle of Narvik. They were very vulnerable. Then I'd put the Thai coast defense ships. They are not spectacularly powerful, but they are a bit faster, a bit more seaworthy, and a little bit more modern. Then I'd put the Finnish ships, Ilmarinen and Vainamoinen. They are rather unstable, which really doesn't help, but they are quite powerful as long as they're able to fire their guns. So as for coast defense, for coast defense, I mean, yeah, on paper their stats are greater than Norge and Eidsvold and the Thai ships. You could maybe argue that the Thai ship should be above them because the Thai ship's a bit more seaworthy, but the ultimate winner of that ranking is always going to be the Sverriers, because they're powerful, relatively fast for coast defense ships, and they are quite seaworthy. Robert Denduven asks, why do no historians seem to hold Nimitz at fault for not trying to get Saratoga out to the Battle of Midway by June 4th, since they seem to hold the Japanese at fault for not using Suikaku? Essentially because there wasn't much wrong with Zuikaku as a ship. Saratoga had been a little bit torpedoed, so Saratoga was a case of, well, we have to physically fix this ship, then we have to get an air group onto it, then we have to get the ship from the US to Pearl Harbor and then out into action, which is a sequence of events with relatively minimal opportunity for cost cutting. Whereas with Zuikaku, it would have just been put a different air group on it. You've actually got the pilots and the aircraft, just not Zuikaku's ones, but just put them on it and off you go. So yeah, there's a lot less that would have needed to be done to get Zuikaku out there. W. Osterberg says, just to let you know, there is a company that makes a plushy battleship of BB-64. Well, maybe there's a plushy warspite that could be done. Echo Mage 1215, what would happen if the Japanese Navy sent their full battle line to seize control of Guadalcanal? Would they succeed given the US Navy's diminished state? Depends when in the campaign. Because the full, if we're talking their capital ships, cruisers, destroyers, they could easily dominate the surface, but you've got Henderson Field and American carriers in the offing. Okay, you can shoot up Henderson Field, excuse me, certainly with that many capital ships, but the full battle line would also therefore involve bringing in as many carriers as you could. And could you win that carrier battle or potentially drive off the Americans in the aftermath with your capital ships? Yes. How long would it stick for? Don't know. Would it be a huge expenditure of fuel? Yes. So yeah, at certain stages of the Guadalcanal campaign, if the Japanese had gone all in with their fleet versus the strength of force the US had present, yes, they could have seized control of Guadalcanal. Of course, then you've got the issue of the US is probably going to know that they're on their way, at which point, what do they do in response? How do they change things up? I'm just going to get some iron brew going because I'm beginning to run out of voice. Giant USS New Jersey Stein. Carl Gustav asks, using my giant time machine, I send an Iowa into the past. How far back in time can I send it before the technology can no longer be reverse engineered and is instead regarded as magic? Probably around the 1900s. Now, some technology is going to be less reverse engineerable much sooner than that, like radar, but the basic idea and principles of radar, certainly if one of the instruction manuals survive, wouldn't be out of the question as understandable in the 1900s when radio is just really kicking off. It's like, oh yes, it's an advanced adapted form of radio. Fine, we don't necessarily understand the exact technology, but we understand its principles. And stuff like the guns and the shells and the geared turbines and stuff, again, would be comprehensible. If you go much back into the 19th century, let's say like the 1870s, you know, when steel has only just started to be produced in large quantities, at that point, the vast majority of what's on Iowa is going to be, yeah, this may well be future tech, and we can kind of see about how maybe this is going to develop, but no idea how to reverse engineer it at that stage. The Stoned Abbot had a question. What criteria did a British merchant ship need to qualify for a blue ensign, e.g. Titanic flying under Captain Smith's command? I've seen different answers. As far as I'm aware, I mean, it depends on the time period. But the a blue ensign, because there are lots of different subvariants of blue ensigns, especially nowadays, it essentially means some kind of Royal Navy auxiliary or a Royal Navy or a ship that could be an auxiliary in the Royal Navy. It has some kind of design measure into it. So with Titanic, it's both a Royal Mail ship, so it has a charter in that respect, but also, like a number of other large liners, Titanic had been specifically built with strengthened points on her deck for the mounting of guns to turn her into an armed merchant cruiser in the event of war. And that involved a small Admiralty subsidy. So at that point, both of those would allow her to fly a blue ensign. Whereas, a random tramp freighter really shouldn't be doing that. Paul Pomikala asks, post-Ironclad, there were ships with a small number of overly large guns. Were there ever ships designed with a ridiculous number of smaller caliber guns? It depends what you mean by smaller caliber, but yes, in the first 20 or so years of Ironclad warship design, there were various designs put forth at points where, when you looked at the 9, 10, 11 or 12-inch guns that were present in relatively small numbers, especially on central battery and turret ironclads, there were times when people were like, well, actually, if we use guns that are 2, 3, 4 inches smaller than that, but in huge numbers, relatively speaking, we're talking like 10, 15 guns instead of 2 or 3, then that might work better. So yeah, there were those kinds of designs. If you're talking about ridiculous numbers of guns, as in, no big guns, but loads of 4 or 5 or 6 inch guns, and that exclusively, for capital ships, not really. I suppose you could argue powerful and terrible, maybe, but they're cruisers. Michael Shakespeare asks, is it true that the Iowas were built with one thing different than the others, like New Jersey being built with her guns capable of firing like an 18-inch gun, or another ship being particularly fast? The Iowas are not particularly different from each other, except Iowa is a flagship, so she has an extra level to her conning tower and some more accommodation. New Jersey doesn't have guns capable of firing like 18-inch guns. The 16-inch 50 has the penetration that's close to period 18-inch guns, and perhaps a little bit superior than World War I era 18-inch guns, and of course they are quite fast. So the Iowas as a class are somewhat distinct from pretty much every other capital ship built in World War II, because they're essentially battle cruiser speed, but with battleship armament and very heavy battleship armament and battleship grade armor. But New Jersey, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri are all broadly similar to each other, although of course that is in any class there is always going to be a ship that is a little bit faster than the others. Although of interesting note is the fact the Iowas actually have 2 different firing modes for armor-piercing shells, which is unlike most other ships, in that they have a sort of a close to medium range firing mode where they fire their guns, the 16-inch 50s, with full charges and so forth, but they also have a firing mode for long range fire, which they can use against capital ship targets if they choose, where it's actually everything is modified to make the 16-inch 50 fire with the similar ballistics to the 16-inch 45, because at long range, the 16-inch 45 with the lower muzzle velocity actually drops its shells more steeply on the target, which is better for armor penetration. Awindil asking for the Discord invite link. There should be a Discord invite link in the video description of every video. Maduros Obajar asks, had they not crashed in the interwar period, would the Akron-class carriers have been of any use during World War II? Akron or Akron? Been of any use in World War II at all? Yes, as convoy escorts. Because, well, assuming that the weather holds for them, they would have been very useful anti-submarine convoy escorts, because, hey, they're up in the air, they've got really good spotting capabilities all across the ocean, and they can send out their aircraft to do even more spotting, and potentially, maybe even the aircraft could be fitted with something heavier than a machine gun to actually attack the U-boats. At the very least, machine guns and so forth, they could, keep the U-boats suppressed and or call in escorts. So yes, as anti-submarine escorts, the flying aircraft carriers could have had a certain degree of utility, at least until bad weather caught up with them. Joe Buetner, I think, asks, in 1935, an Englishman familiar with Davis guns mounts 6-inch recoilless rifles on fast catamarans, ejecting countermass between the hulls. How would these craft do if they replaced MTBs and PT boats? I don't think they do particularly well replacing the MTBs and PT boats, mostly because those classes of vessels relied on torpedoes for the most part as their armament, and a torpedo can do a lot more damage than a single 6-inch gun, and is a little bit stealthier in a lot of times, especially once the PT boats had worked out roll-off launchers instead of black powder launchers. A 6-inch recoilless rifle, however, might have had favour supplementing or replacing MGBs, the motor gunboats, because a 6-inch shell that smashes into an E-boat is going to pretty much total the E-boat instantly. My only concern would be specifically with that caliber, because 6-inch ammunition is quite heavy, quite difficult to manage. And on something small, especially on something small like a fast catamaran, so there may be some problems with actually loading, aiming and firing the thing. Whereas perhaps if it was a 4 or 4.5-inch recoilless rifle, that would probably be the best of both worlds, because that kind of gun would have probably single part ammunition, one-piece ammunition, much easier to reload, and it's most likely that ammunition would be lighter weight and therefore more easy to manage. And to be honest, if you are an E-boat, if you get hit by a 4 or 4.5-inch high explosive shell or a 6-inch high explosive shell, it probably isn't going to make the huge amount of difference to your overall survival. Zachary Elmerman asks, what is the difference between a rangefinder and a fire control director, and what other systems may be installed to a fire control director? So a rangefinder is, well, just what it says on the tin. It is a system by which you determine the range, and usually also the bearing, to a specific target. You would then have to tell that to a turret, your guns in their turrets, and you say, okay, well, the enemy is currently, let's say, 20,000 yards away. with just a rangefinder, that's useful for elevating the guns to what should, in theory at least, be the correct range, but leading the target and correcting for weather and the ship's roll and pitch and everything is not something that the rangefinder can do for you. The fire control director, fire control computer, whatever you want to call it, takes the input from the rangefinder and a number of other things, including inputs about course and speed, enemy course and speed, the weather, temperature, and so on and so forth, and digests all of that and then spits out, hopefully continuously, a set of information that tells the guns, okay, not only is the enemy over there at this bearing, but this is where you need to shoot in order to drop your shells on top of him. And then obviously if you fire and there's a need for correction, you can work out hopefully which factors have gone awry and make the adjustments. So the fire control director, fire control computer, is the much more complicated heart of it all. The rangefinder just tells you what range the enemy is at. And that's why the introduction of rangefinders allows the battle range to move beyond what the human eye can estimate, but not hugely further. Whereas once the fire control director comes in and can start factoring in lots of different factors, then suddenly battle ranges jump hugely. The Victory Over Himself asks, are you aware of anything special about the design or service of the light carrier USS Saipan, named ship of her class, as my grandfather served on her during the war and I have his US Navy service uniform? So yeah, there's a few things. I have actually done a 5-minute guide on the Saipan class, so I would direct you to that as well. But in brief, Saipan class was the first purpose-built light fleet carrier in US Navy service. The previous ones, the Independences, have been adapted from Cleveland-class cruisers. Saipan was designed from the keel up as a light fleet carrier, which obviously made her more capable. And later on, post-war, she actually did a lot of interesting experimental work with communications at sea and so forth. And in service, obviously, not a huge amount of service in the 1940s, but a very capable vessel, which is why she was kept around for quite a while. But yeah, I would say, generally speaking, take a look at the 5-minute guide I've done on her and her sister ship, and go from there. Or, as I say, drop me a message if you want further information or clarification on anything I say in that video. Okay, I think I am going to actually wrap things up at 11 o'clock. That seems like a good thing to do. That means we've done about 3 hours, but it has been a very long day, preparing videos and so forth, and shopping and picking up mini track, etc. So yeah, that'll be the time to call it a night, I think. Myron Pross, if the High Seas Fleet mutinied en route to Scapa Flow and got interned in Holland, could the Dutch keep them under the Washington Naval Treaty, and which ships would be useful in protecting the Netherlands in 1942? No, the Dutch could not keep all of them. I mean, the Dutch would have to be part of the Washington Naval Treaty, but the fate of the fleet would be decided long before that by, the Versailles negotiations and everybody just being very angry with them. I mean, the British would probably not be too fussed with the Dutch having them, to be perfectly honest, because the main thing the British wanted with the High Seas Fleet is that the Germans shouldn't have it, and neither should anybody else. So if the Dutch suddenly have the most modern units of the High Seas Fleet, well, the British know there's no way the Dutch are going to be able to maintain and keep them running, so they're almost all going to be scrapped very quickly, which suits Britain's needs perfectly well. The French, who want some ships to modernise their navy, and the Americans, who want to study them, would be a little bit more annoyed. But in terms of which ships, if the Dutch could keep any of them, would be useful for protecting the Netherlands in 42, well, you can forget the submarines and the destroyers and the cruisers. They're all going to be hopelessly out of date by then. Hindenburg and Der Flinger though, would probably be quite useful. That's probably about the maximum I could see the Dutch actually keeping around long term and slightly modernising, and a somewhat modernised Hindenburg and Der Flinger with a bunch of modern Dutch equipment on them could be quite useful at helping out the Netherlands East Indies, or the Dutch East Indies, because, well, armour-wise, they're considerably superior to the Congos. Firepower-wise, obviously 12-inch guns versus 14-inch, but the Congo's armour is a lot thinner, and the Dutch probably would have upgraded the guns at some point. So, it would give the Allies a pair of fast capital ships, which would certainly be able to walk all over pretty much any of the Japanese cruisers and so forth, and force the Japanese to bring the Congos into play, and they'd still have a reasonable chance, assuming there weren't like 3 or 4 Congos. Vicky asks, was Jean Bart salvo at Suez the only time post-World War II that a non-US battleship fired its guns in anger? Most likely. In anger, certainly. Obviously, training, Vanguard, and so forth fired, but yeah, the Soviets didn't use what was left of their battleship force. The Italians had to scrap theirs. The Japanese weren't allowed them. The King George V were in reserve. Vanguard didn't engage in Korea. Yeah, as far as the major navies are concerned, yeah, that's pretty much it, outside of obviously the US Navy. BR Class 47, did any privateers fly their own flag alongside the flag of the country they were working for? Yeah, quite often. If you look at the accurate paintings of Age of Sail ships, you'll notice that very often they have banners. US ships often have propaganda flags as well as their national flag. Obviously, flagships, literal flagships with admirals on board, have the admiral's flag as well as the national flag or ensign. So yeah, privateers very often could fly their own flag of whatever variety they wanted to. Where are we? Someone pointing out the Benny Hill team tune is, of course, Yakety Sax. Nick M asks, how the heck did they spot torpedoes? Was there a designated torpedo spotter guy, and how easy or hard were they to spot? So there would, in World War II at least, and to a certain extent World War I, but not so much, as you'll see, there were 2 primary ways to spot torpedoes. In World War II, you could use hydrophones, aka passive sonar, and you could listen for the torpedo motor going whoa, and the propellers, and so obviously. And then, of course, you could get a bearing and go, there appears to be a high-speed object being driven by a propeller heading our direction. That's probably not a good thing. Hydrophones did exist to a certain degree in World War I, but you're much less likely to be using them to listen to incoming torpedoes because they're much less advanced and much less common. The more typical way of spotting a torpedo, there wasn't a designated, hey, you are responsible for spotting torpedoes specifically, but everybody who was on lookout duty would include spotting for torpedoes as part of their duty. And what you would be looking for usually, unless something had gone dramatically wrong with the torpedo, was not the torpedo itself, but you were looking for the bubbles of the torpedo in its wake, because, of course, the vast majority of torpedoes were driven by internal combustion with compressed air tanks, which meant you have exhaust. That exhaust has to go somewhere. You can't just keep it inside the torpedo, otherwise it's going to go pop. So it gets exhausted out of the torpedo, bubbles up to the surface, so you see a little trail of bubbles as the torpedo motors towards you. This was one of the reasons why the Long Lance and its derivatives were so dangerous, because not only were they moving at high speed with a very large warhead, but because they burned oxygen, there wasn't waste exhaust gas, and therefore they didn't have the telltale trail of bubbles that you could use to try and spot where the torpedo was. Luke Riley asks, in an alternate timeline where the Brazilian Empire becomes the USA's main rival vying for supremacy of the Western Hemisphere, what type of ships would they build in the Age of Sail, or for ironclads, etc.? Well, Age of Sail ships, to be honest, are all much for muchness, relatively speaking. For the Brazilians, probably you want something like, by the time Brazil is independent, and well, semi-independent. In any case, you probably want a two-decker ship of the line for the 1830s-1840s. Not really much point in building massive three-deckers. They don't really have the resources for it, and the Americans don't have any active duty ships of the line anyway. They do have some ships of the line, but they're all up in ordinary and reserve. So an 1830s, 1840s modern design two-decker with lots of shell guns would be quite useful. When it comes to ironclads, you probably want a mix. Again, for cost reasons, I mean, assuming in this timeline the Brazilian Empire presumably has a lot more economic and industrial resources going for it, but even so, you would probably want a squadron, so 3 or 4 ocean-going ironclads of maybe 7,000 to 10,000 tons, because, well, the USA is all the way up north, so you need some way of going over there and saying hello. But the majority of ironclads that you'd probably want to build would be smaller, shorter range ones, because Brazil has a huge coastline. So something a bit like Huascar, or maybe just a fraction larger, would be a fairly good idea, because you could have a bunch of those all over the place for a lot less than some of the really big stuff. And of course, they can deploy to the Caribbean and so forth. They've got enough capability. You could take them across the Caribbean and up north if you wanted to end up in a big sea battle. But as kind of coastal defense and control vessels, they make a lot better bet. And you'd pretty much take that and cycle it as you go up and up and up through the eras. You know, have an array of powerful coast defense ships that are relatively cheap to build, with a core of ocean-going, heavily armored vessels, because that would force the US to either cede the initiative to you or maintain its own fleet, which Congress seems to be generally loath to do. People are saying the mic apparently had a bit of a moment. Okay. The Victory Over Himself asks, are you I've already answered that one. Robert Denduvan saying Saratoga was fully repaired in San Diego Harbor on May 25th, 1942. Yeah, then it has to embark its air group, get its crew, work itself back up again, and physically sail to Pearl Harbor. All of that takes a considerable amount of time. 96831, why is it forgotten that the County class cruisers were not treaty compliant? They technically were, you know, displacement, etc. wise. The County class were treaty compliant, but they almost certainly had cheats built in to allow them to exceed the treaty limits without too much effect on their overall structure, unless you're HMS London. That's a slightly different matter. That's kind of, they're quite literally, as far as I can tell, built for but not with. Right, so we have in fact reached the end of this particular live stream. So we'll pick up again at some point, probably in early September, just before I head over to the US with the next two alternate history questions. And we'll end on a question from Miles McCaskill, who asks, are there any interesting books within easy arms reach that you feel like telling us about? Yes, there are. So, I finally got my hands on a copy of this, which I've been looking for a while. I had a badly scanned PDF of it for ages, but now I actually have a paper copy. British Carrier Aviation, The Evolution of Their Ships and Their Aircraft by Norman Friedman. That goes very well with British Aircraft Carriers by David Hobbs. Good set. I just need to make space on the shelf for it to go. Also in the carrier line of things, the Squadrons and Units of the Fleet Air Arm. This is a rather wonderful book. I am very, very slowly building up a spreadsheet which charts exactly which Fleet Air Arm squadrons were on which ships and when and what aircraft they had, because that book actually tells you everything you want to know. I might at some point, if I'm feeling particularly sadomasochistic, go in and start quantifying the 700 series squadrons, i.e. the catapult flights with their little scouter planes and everything. But so, for example, to give you an idea of the level of detail in this book, I'm going to go to the 800 series of squadrons. That's 823. Nope, gone too far. That's 799. Here you go. So 801. So for 801 squadron, you've got identification markings. You've got their squadron bases, so I can tell you exactly when they were aboard ships. So, for example, on the 8th of May 1933, they were aboard HMS Furious, but by the 20th of July 1933, they were not. Then they were back on HMS Furious on the 7th of December, back off of it on the 17th of October, and so on and so on and so on as it goes. But also, you can literally just read off in the text what it was equipped with. So, very briefly, formed in April 1933 as a squadron that has 3 flycatchers and 6 Nimrods. The flycatchers then give way to Ospreys in early 1934. So you got 3 Ospreys and 6 Nimrods. The Nimrods are withdrawn in October 1936. Then, so they're all Ospreys now. Then Skewers and Sea Gladiators are in early 1939. And then when it's reformed and stuck on Ark Royal, you have 6 Skewers. Then you get 6 Rocks in June 1940. But very briefly thereafter, they're replaced by Skewers, so you now have 12 Skewers, and so on and so on and so forth. So if you go through that all, eventually you can work out at any given time if someone says, oh, well, what did HMS Ark Royal have aboard on, I don't know, November the 13th, 1940? Once my project is complete, I will be able to tell you not only which squadrons were aboard, but exactly which aircraft and what types of aircraft were aboard. So that's carriers. Oh, that's... no. Ow. What else have I got down in easy reach? Trying to look for recent acquisitions you may not have seen me go through. Oh! Where have you gone? Andrew Lambert's The British Way of War, all about Julian Corbett. I need to do a video mostly based on that, about Corbett, because I've done one about Mahan, so do one about Corbett at some point. If I pull those books out, the whole thing's going to collapse, so I won't do that. Oh, Before Jutland and After Jutland, about the Royal Navy in World War I by James Goldrick. Both very excellent books. Most of those you can't get anymore because they're out of print. Oh, and another one I've been reading recently, which I definitely would recommend if you want an alternate take on what was responsible for the victories at sea in World War II, Battleship Victory by Robert Lundgren. As the name suggests, puts a lot more of the credit to the Allied victories on battleships than the traditional narrative would perhaps have. Right, okay. So, as you may have detected, that was pretty much my voice going, nah, we've had it now. So, thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this live stream. As I say, the next one hopefully will be somewhere week commencing the 2nd of September. And hopefully we'll have slightly fewer questions to work through before I can start taking questions from the audience. And hopefully also in September I will see some of you at the USNI headquarters at Annapolis, some of you at USS Cod, others of you at USS Slater, and perhaps one or two of you in San Diego. Other than that, I may organise a trip to Chatham or Portsmouth or Belfast at some point in the near future, maybe end of September, beginning of October, but we shall see. Oh, and spoiler alert for those of you who are up in Europe at this unreasonable hour of the night. Hopefully next year I will be doing a tour of northern mainland Europe by car. So France, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Poland, Germany, not necessarily in that order, but I will be out there. So, right. See you all later. Bye for now.